I had always wanted to escape the noise of the city, the endless honking, the crowded sidewalks, the constant buzz of people everywhere. It all made me feel like I was being pushed from every side, like I had no space to think or breathe. When I finally got the chance to take a week off work, I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods. The idea was simple: leave everything behind for a while, live off the grid, and just exist. I didn't need internet or cell signal. I didn't even need electricity. I just needed isolation. The cabin I rented was on the edge of a national forest, far enough from any road that even the nearest neighbor was a few miles away. It was a small, wooden structure with a tin roof, one bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and a stove that ran on wood. The real charm of the place was the porch, which overlooked a clearing surrounded by dense trees. The forest stretched as far as I could see, with only the sound of wind and birds breaking the silence. When I arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and earth, and the quiet felt so heavy it almost pressed against my skin. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A small wooden table sat in the corner, 2 chairs, a bookshelf filled with old novels, and a mattress on a wooden frame. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the wind brushing against the outside. I unpacked my bag slowly, placing my clothes in a corner and setting my few food supplies on the counter. I stacked firewood near the stove, knowing the nights would be cold. The first evening was calm. I started a small fire, boiled some water for tea, and watched the orange light flicker across the wooden walls. Outside, the forest was dark, and I could just barely make out the shapes of the trees against the fading light. The first night was peaceful, almost unreal in its silence. No traffic, no hum of electricity, just the occasional rustle of leaves. I slept with the window slightly open, letting the cold air fill the cabin. When I woke in the morning, sunlight streamed in, and the forest felt alive in a way the city never did. Birds moved from branch to branch, and a squirrel scurried across the clearing. I made coffee, ate a small breakfast, and decided to take a short walk along the trail behind the cabin. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. It twisted between trees and climbed small hills. I walked slowly, taking in every detail: the way moss clung to rocks, the way the wind bent branches, the smell of damp soil. It was peaceful, almost meditative. After a while, I reached a small creek that cut through the forest. Water ran clear over smooth stones, and I knelt to drink from it, feeling the cold bite of the water on my lips. I stayed there for some time, just listening to the water and the forest. Returning to the cabin, I began to settle into a routine. Mornings were for walks and gathering firewood. Afternoons were for reading or exploring the surroundings. Evenings were for cooking and sitting by the fire. I felt completely alone, but not lonely. I enjoyed the solitude. The second night, I heard something unusual. It was faint, almost a whisper at first, but distinct. A snapping of branches, not far from the cabin, as if something was moving carefully through the underbrush. My first thought was a deer or some other animal, and I told myself not to worry. The sound repeated, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I stayed awake longer that night, listening, but it never approached the cabin directly. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. On the third day, I noticed footprints in the clearing. They were large, human, and they led in a pattern that suggested someone had been pacing near the cabin. My stomach sank. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived, and I knew no one could have gotten here without taking the long trail. The prints were too fresh to be old. I checked the surrounding area carefully, but there was no sign of a person now. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a ranger or a hiker had passed nearby, but why would they have come so close without knocking or leaving a note? That night, the feeling of being watched returned. I lit the fire and sat close to it, listening for any sound. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I turned, there was nothing. I tried to sleep anyway, keeping my phone and a flashlight by my side. The next day, I decided to take a longer walk along the trail to see if I could find any clues about who had been near the cabin. I brought a backpack with water, snacks, and my small first aid kit. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and the further I went, the more isolated it felt. Birds flew overhead, squirrels darted between the trees, and every so often I could hear the distant sound of water from another creek. After a while, I came to a small ridge that overlooked a part of the forest I hadn't seen from the cabin. And then I saw it. An old, abandoned cabin, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and trees. It looked like no one had lived there for years, but the ground around it was trampled, as if someone had been there recently. My pulse quickened. I stayed there for a while, scanning the area. The forest was quiet, but the weight of the isolation was pressing. I could feel that someone had been there, maybe watching. I decided to head back quickly, taking note of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. Returning to my cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I had locked it when I left. I approached slowly, pushing it open with a hand trembling slightly. Inside, everything looked the same, but then I noticed something. The firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered across the floor, and one of my food cans was open, its contents spilled. My stomach sank further. Someone had been inside while I was gone. I spent the rest of the day on high alert. I checked the windows, reinforced the locks, and moved some furniture near the door to block it. I kept my flashlight, a kitchen knife, and my phone close at all times. The forest outside seemed calm, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every shadow, every movement of leaves in the wind made me jump. I barely slept that night, sitting by the fire and staring at the windows. On the fourth day, I decided I couldn't just wait. I packed a small bag with essentials and started walking toward the main road, hoping to find a ranger station or some sign of people. The trail was longer and more complicated than I expected. Trees were dense, roots and rocks made walking slow, and the path was easy to lose. As I moved, I kept thinking about the abandoned cabin and the footprints. Someone had been following me, and I had no way to know if they were still nearby. By late afternoon, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. The trail had vanished, replaced by thick underbrush. My heart raced as I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest all looked the same. Panic began to set in. The sun was dropping behind the trees, and I had no idea how far I was from my cabin. The thought of spending the night lost in the forest was terrifying. I forced myself to slow down, to think clearly, and to mark my path by breaking small branches and stacking stones. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest grew cold, the sounds of nocturnal animals filling the silence. Owls called in the distance, and small creatures rustled through the underbrush. I kept moving, guided only by memory and faint traces of the trail. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I froze, straining my ears. When nothing moved, I started walking again, trying not to look back. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell in the dark. Finally, I stumbled upon a small creek, the same one I had visited earlier. Relief washed over me. I followed it, hoping it would lead back toward the cabin or a main trail. My legs were sore, my body exhausted, but I forced myself to keep moving. Eventually, I saw a faint light through the trees. I ran toward it, tripping over roots and rocks. As I got closer, I realized it was my cabin. The door was still reinforced with the furniture I had moved, and the fire was still faintly glowing in the stove from earlier. I collapsed onto the porch, exhausted, shaking, and trying to calm my racing heart. I spent the next day reinforcing the cabin further. I dug shallow trenches around the perimeter, tied makeshift alarms using tin cans and string, and moved the furniture to create barricades. I stayed alert every minute, but the intruder did not return. Days passed, and I gradually began to relax, though the fear never left entirely. By the end of the week, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had survived the week alone, had faced the fear of being watched and possibly attacked, and had learned more about my own resilience than I ever imagined. When I finally drove back to the city, I felt different, stronger, more aware, and profoundly grateful for safety and ordinary life. The cabin remained behind me, silent, empty. I had been driving for hours through the winding roads of the northern forests, the kind of roads that never seemed to end, the kind where each curve brought the same endless wall of trees closer, tighter, darker. My destination was a cabin that I had rented for a week, mostly to escape the noise of the city and the ceaseless responsibilities that had been building up over the last year. The GPS had guided me to a dirt path that looked less like a road and more like a trail, overgrown at the edges with grass and wild weeds pushing through cracks in the soil. The sun was dipping lower as I drove, painting everything in a dull, red-gold light, and already the forest seemed to swallow sound. Even my own car seemed quieter here, the engine muffled by the dense line of pine and fir trees. The cabin itself came into view without warning, tucked into a small clearing, almost camouflaged against the shadows of the surrounding forest. It was a wooden structure, not particularly large, with a steep roof covered in dark shingles. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and it seemed, at first glance, welcoming. I parked the car on the rough, uneven ground in front of the porch, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires. I stepped out, taking a moment to feel the air, which smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and a faint, almost metallic tang that I couldn't place. My backpack and supplies felt heavy, but I shrugged them onto my shoulders and climbed the small steps to the cabin. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a stove, a sink, and a few shelves stocked with basic supplies. A table sat near the window, overlooking the forest, and a small sofa faced a fireplace that had clearly not been used in months. The bedroom was simple, a bed with thick blankets and a small wooden dresser. I set down my bag and walked around slowly, taking everything in. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the walls had that dry, musty smell of a place that had been closed up for a long time. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt lived in, abandoned only in the sense that no one had been there recently. But there was a subtle tension in the air, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting. I unpacked my things, stacked firewood near the fireplace, and decided to take a walk around the clearing before night fell completely. The forest pressed close to the cabin on all sides, thick and dark, and every step I took along the perimeter made a soft, snapping sound as my boots crushed twigs and pine cones. Birds called out in the distance, but there was no movement closer, no rustling other than the occasional wind through the trees. I felt an odd mix of isolation and relief, the kind of solitude I hadn't realized I had been craving. But even as I walked, I noticed something off. The undergrowth had paths, faint tracks leading into the deeper forest, too straight and deliberate to be natural. I followed them for a moment, curiosity tugging at me, before turning back, deciding it was better to save the exploring for daylight. By the time I returned, the sun had disappeared, leaving only a thin glow on the horizon. I lit the fireplace, the kindling catching quickly, and the warmth spread through the room. The light danced across the walls, creating shadows that stretched and shifted as the fire flickered. I made a small dinner, nothing complicated, just something to fill the stomach, and ate while sitting near the fire. Outside, the forest was now completely dark, the sounds of nocturnal animals rising as the wind picked up. Every so often, I thought I heard something closer than it should have been. A crack of a branch, a rustle of leaves. But when I looked toward the windows, there was nothing visible. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps a deer moving through the trees. Sleep came eventually, heavy and deep, but it did not last. Around midnight, I awoke to a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking slowly across the wooden porch. My heart jumped, and I lay still, listening. The sound continued, deliberate, measured, almost waiting. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to reason through it. There was no car parked anywhere, no other signs of people nearby. Yet the tapping persisted. Finally, curiosity and fear combined into a strange urge, and I got out of bed, moving toward the window with cautious steps. I pulled the curtain aside, looking into the darkness. Nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. I waited, straining my ears, but there was no further sound. I eventually convinced myself it had been a branch falling or some small animal and returned to bed, though the sleep that followed was fitful, shadowed with unease. The next day, I tried to shake the previous night from my mind. I explored the cabin more thoroughly, noting the small details I had missed. The way the floorboards warped near the corners, the faint stains on the kitchen tiles, the small pile of ashes in the fireplace that hadn't fully cooled. I spent the day walking along the small trails surrounding the cabin, marking paths on my map, taking photographs, making mental notes. As I moved deeper into the forest, I began noticing subtle signs of something unusual. Footprints in the soft mud, larger than a human's, yet not quite matching any animal I knew. Marks on the tree trunks, as if something had scratched at the bark. At first, I rationalized it. Maybe a bear, a large deer, someone else camping nearby. But the more I saw, the less convincing the explanations became. There was a deliberate pattern, almost like something was following the same loop, coming close to the cabin but never venturing inside. By the third night, the feeling of unease had deepened. I kept the fire going long after dark, even though it consumed more wood than necessary. Every sound outside seemed amplified: the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant howl of some animal. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Slow, measured footsteps on the porch. I froze, listening. This time, I could hear something more. An occasional scuff against the wood, faint, deliberate. I gripped the fireplace poker, staring at the window, trying to convince myself that it was impossible, that there was no one there. But then, the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire blazing, barely sleeping, imagining every possible scenario. The fourth day, I decided to investigate the trails more deliberately, taking extra precautions. I packed supplies, a knife, a flashlight, and even a small first aid kit just in case. As I followed one of the deeper paths, I realized I had been walking in circles. The forest was denser than I had anticipated, and landmarks were deceptive. I noticed more signs: broken branches at shoulder height, footprints in mud that appeared too deliberate to be accidental, and small objects that seemed placed rather than fallen. Sticks aligned in patterns, stones arranged in short lines. My unease grew into something closer to fear. Whoever or whatever had been making these signs was aware of me. I had the instinctive knowledge that someone had been tracking my movements. That night, I returned to the cabin and double-checked every lock, every window, and even secured the doors with the heavy furniture in the room. Sleep was out of the question. I sat by the fire until dawn, the sense of being watched pressing against every nerve in my body. By the fifth day, the tension had reached a point that was hard to endure. I started hearing more outside, even during the day: distant footsteps in the underbrush, the occasional low crack of a branch breaking under weight, something moving with intent. I began noticing subtle patterns in the signs outside. The footprints followed loops that always led back near the cabin. I started carrying the knife everywhere, moving silently, checking every room multiple times, never leaving a window or door unchecked. It was a psychological strain, each night stretching endlessly, with every small sound magnified into a potential threat. I could no longer tell whether the fear was real or imagined, but the evidence outside, the tracks, the disturbances, the clear signs of someone or something shadowing me, made it impossible to dismiss entirely. The sixth night, I decided I could no longer stay passive. I prepared for a confrontation in a way that seemed extreme but necessary. I set traps around the cabin, simple ones made with heavy objects, tripwires using string, and cans that would make a loud noise. I placed these in positions that would alert me if anyone tried to approach while I was awake. I gathered all the remaining firewood inside to prevent anyone from hiding near the stack, and arranged furniture so that every approach to the doors and windows was visible from my central position near the fire. I felt like a soldier on watch, my senses heightened to every sound, every shadow, every shift in the wind. Hours passed with nothing, and then, just past midnight, the sounds began again. Footsteps approaching, deliberate, cautious, followed by a sudden silence near the door. I could hear someone breathing, My heart raced, and I gripped the knife tightly, every muscle tensed. The first scuff of a foot on the porch was followed by a second. I never thought a simple weekend trip to a remote cabin could turn into the kind of ordeal that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I had always considered myself prepared, cautious, someone who knew how to handle emergencies. I had planned everything in advance: maps, food, water, first aid kit, extra clothing, batteries, flashlights, a fully charged phone, even a small camping stove in case the electricity didn't work. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, but it was advertised as sturdy, isolated, and surrounded by dense woods, far from the nearest neighbor. That isolation is what had appealed to me. The idea of being alone in nature, cut off from everything, a break from work, from people, from all the noise. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I expected, winding through narrow mountain roads that twisted around sheer cliffs and thick forest. It was mid-October, the air was crisp and cool, and the trees were turning gold and red, their leaves swirling on the ground with the occasional gust of wind. The last few miles, I had to leave the main road and follow a dirt track that gradually became narrower, rougher, and almost overgrown in places. My car handled it, but I had to go very slowly, my eyes constantly scanning for rocks or fallen branches. Even then, I had to stop a couple of times to remove debris. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, the forest casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the ground. I parked my car in a small clearing near the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat sound loud. The cabin itself was modest, built from weathered logs, with a small porch and a pitched roof. A chimney hinted at a wood-burning stove inside. I carried in my bags and took a moment to look around. Beyond the clearing, the forest rose in all directions. There was a stream somewhere down the slope to the east, and I could hear the faint sound of water rushing over rocks. It all felt peaceful, beautiful, even in a way that made me almost forget why I was there, to be alone, to disconnect. I unpacked slowly, methodically, arranging things in the small kitchen and bedroom area. I made a fire in the stove and watched the flames dance, feeling a quiet satisfaction. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive, and for a while, I felt completely safe. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind or an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon rummaging through the leaves. But there was something about the pattern that didn't feel right. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone moving carefully through the underbrush. I told myself I was imagining things and eventually went back to sleep. The next morning, the forest looked different somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the quiet had a sharp edge now, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I went for a short walk, trying to calm my unease. The air was damp, the ground slippery with fallen leaves. As I followed the path down toward the stream, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints in the soft mud. They were fresh and not like any animal tracks I knew. Human, barefoot or in soft shoes. They didn't follow the path exactly. They came from the deeper woods and disappeared again into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, feeling a cold pulse of fear. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone, but the thought of someone else being this deep in the woods without telling me made me tense. I decided it was probably another hiker or a local, but still, I went back to the cabin faster than I intended. I spent the rest of the day inside, doing chores, keeping busy, trying to shake off the feeling. I checked the locks, reinforced the windows, made sure the firewood was stacked near the door. I kept my phone charged and my flashlight at the ready. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind rattling the branches, the creaking of the cabin settling, the occasional snap of a twig outside. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the darkness. I told myself it was the isolation getting to me, that my mind was playing tricks. The following morning, I went outside to fetch more wood from the pile near the cabin. I noticed my car had something odd on the windshield. Tiny scratches in a pattern, almost like someone had dragged a branch or a stone across it deliberately. I froze. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger, sharper. I spent the entire day inside, pacing, checking all the doors and windows, barricading what I could with furniture. I avoided going outside unless I had to. By the third night, I had barricaded the front door with a chair and a piece of wood, checked every lock, and kept a heavy hammer beside the bed. I could hear movement outside almost constantly, faint at first, then closer, more deliberate. Something was circling the cabin. I knew I had to do something. Staying was no longer safe. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt like a trap. I considered walking out, but the forest was dense, and I had no clear path down to the main road. My car might be safe, but if whoever or whatever was out there noticed me moving, I had no way to know what would happen. I spent the day thinking through my options, feeling my anxiety sharpen with every passing hour. I couldn't stay, and I couldn't move without risk. Late in the afternoon, I decided to try to signal for help. I had a portable emergency beacon in my bag, meant for hiking trips. I turned it on, sending a signal that should reach the local ranger station. I didn't know how long it would take, but I had no other choice. I stayed in the cabin, keeping my back to the wall, eyes on the windows, listening to the forest. Shadows moved, branches snapped, but I didn't see anyone. Hours passed slowly, every minute a struggle. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe it was an animal. But deep down, I knew the tracks, the noises, the scratches on my car. They all meant something. Around midnight, I heard something I hadn't before. A deliberate knock at the cabin door. Not a branch or a rock, a solid, hard knock. My heart raced. I gripped the hammer, every instinct screaming at me. The knocking continued, slow, measured, like someone testing my reaction. I stayed silent, barely breathing. Then, the door rattled, someone pushing against it. My first thought was to barricade further, but the chair wouldn't hold for long if they were determined. I remembered my car. I realized that if I could get to it, I might be able to drive out even if the person followed me. The cabin had no other exit except the back door, which led into the trees. I waited for a long pause, listening. The knocking had stopped. I slowly moved to the back window, peeking through the curtains. Nothing. I could barely see through the darkness, but I didn't hear anyone moving. I made a decision. I grabbed my backpack, flashlight, and the hammer, and I slipped out the back door into the woods, keeping low, moving as silently as possible. My heart pounded with every step, every broken twig beneath my foot making me flinch. The walk to the car felt endless. I kept looking back, expecting to see someone following. The forest was thick, shadows swallowing everything beyond the reach of my flashlight. When I finally reached the clearing where I parked, I nearly collapsed with relief. My car was still there, no one in sight. I threw my bag in the back seat, jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark forest, and I drove slowly at first, then faster as I got onto the dirt track. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I did, I saw the flashing lights of a ranger patrol. They had received my emergency signal and come out to check. I explained everything, showed them the tracks, the scratches, my barricades. They radioed for backup, and within the hour, a small team searched the area. No one was found. The tracks disappeared into the forest, and the cabin was empty. In the end, I never found out who had been circling the cabin or why. The rangers told me it was rare but not unheard of for someone to follow remote cabins, sometimes for robbery, sometimes worse. I left the area the next day, never returning. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched for months afterward, and I realized how naive I had been to think isolation was safe. I had planned everything, but I hadn't accounted for human unpredictability. Now, whenever I go into the woods or even a quiet area, I notice the sounds, the shadows, the small signs of movement. I always carry a signal device, and I never go alone. I still think about that cabin sometimes. The way the forest felt alive and tense, the scratches on the car, the slow, deliberate knocks. But I also think about the choices I made, the calm focus I maintained despite fear, and the fact that I survived. That survival wasn't luck alone. It was planning, awareness, and refusing to panic. The cabin taught me that the wilderness is unpredictable, but the real danger isn't the forest, it's people. I never speak of it often because it sounds strange to anyone who wasn't there. But I remember every detail, every sound, every shadow. I had been driving all day through narrow forest roads, the sun sliding behind the distant mountains as I rounded another curve. The map on my phone had long since stopped updating. Signal was gone somewhere back near the small town I had passed 2 hours ago. I was supposed to be spending the weekend at a cabin I had rented on a secluded lake, a place I thought would give me peace and quiet to write, away from the noise of the city. As I pulled off the gravel road and onto a dirt path that led deeper into the woods, I noticed the first signs of neglect. Faded paint on the sign marking the cabin area, overgrown grass reaching past my knees, and the faint smell of damp earth that seemed stronger as I moved forward. The cabin came into view just as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the trees. It was a small wooden structure, unpainted, with a tin roof that looked like it had seen decades of rain and wind. The windows were dark, some cracked slightly, and the porch sagged under its own weight. The air felt heavier here, thicker with the smell of pine and rot. I parked the car and got out, stretching my stiff muscles from the long drive. My bag felt heavy on my back, loaded with food, water, notebooks, and a small pack of survival gear. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something odd. The front door was closed, but there were deep scratches along its bottom edge, rough and jagged. I knelt down and examined them, feeling a twinge of unease. They didn't look fresh, but they were still unnerving. There were no footprints in the soft dirt, but the scratches suggested something had tried to get in or out. I shook off the feeling. The cabin was likely abandoned for months, maybe years, and the scratches could be from animals. I hoped. Inside, the cabin smelled strongly of damp wood and mold. Dust coated every surface, floating in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. The furniture was sparse. A small wooden table with 2 chairs, a rickety bed frame with no mattress, and a metal stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I set down my bag and went to explore further. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bathroom and another room that seemed to serve as a storage area. Empty shelves, old cans, and broken tools lined the walls. I unpacked my things, trying to ignore the chill that had settled deep into my bones. The sun was gone now, and darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. I lit a small lantern I had brought, its flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. The wind rustled through the trees outside, groaning against the roof in a way that made me tense. I tried to focus on the notebooks I had brought to write, telling myself that I was just letting my imagination run wild. Hours passed. The night grew heavier, and the sounds outside became sharper, closer. I heard the snap of twigs, the rustle of underbrush, small thumps that could have been animals or something else. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, anything but human. But then I heard the first real sound that made my stomach drop. A deliberate, slow scratching coming from the back of the cabin. Not at the door, but at the rear wall just beyond the small window in the storage room. I froze, heart thudding in my chest. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, scraping against the wood. I grabbed a flashlight and approached cautiously, peering through the grime-covered window. Nothing, just the dark forest outside, shadows stretching and twisting as the lantern in the cabin flickered. I told myself to calm down, that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon trying to find food. But then I noticed the marks on the outside wall, fresh claw marks, splintered wood. They trailed down to the ground. Something had been here recently. I moved back inside and locked the door, checking the windows and securing the shutters. I thought about leaving, but the road back was long and dark, and the car was parked in a small clearing where it could be easily spotted by anyone outside. I tried to stay calm, but sleep didn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every brush of wind against the walls, made me flinch. I sat by the stove with the lantern and tried to write, trying to focus on something mundane. Hours passed, and the noises grew more frequent. Scratches along the walls, small thumps on the floorboards, the faint sound of something moving just outside. I refused to look out the windows. Every instinct told me not to, that looking would make it worse. My chest tightened, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything. I found a small can of beans in my bag and opened it, shaking as I poured it into a pan over the old stove. The smell of cooking food was comforting, oddly normal, and I clung to that small routine to keep my fear at bay. Suddenly, the cabin door rattled. Not a small push, but a strong, violent shake, like something was trying to force it open. I grabbed the heaviest object nearby, a metal poker from the fireplace, and braced myself. My breathing was shallow. The rattling continued, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. I waited, frozen, listening to the silence. Then, a faint scraping came from the ceiling above me, slow and methodical. I realized with a jolt that the cabin had a small attic, and whatever was up there was moving. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the poker in hand, listening to every sound, every movement in the darkness. Dawn finally broke, gray and muted behind the thick forest canopy. I ventured outside cautiously, scanning the surroundings. There were tracks, large, heavy prints that didn't look like any animal I knew. They led from the forest to the cabin, then disappeared around the side where the trees were thicker. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew the prints suggested someone, or something, had been watching me. I gathered my bag and locked the cabin, taking extra care to wedge a heavy branch under the door. I moved quickly through the trees, sticking to shadows and keeping my eyes on every movement. The forest seemed endless, and every snap of a twig set my heart racing. Hours later, I stumbled onto a logging road. My car was still where I had left it. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't look back until I was safely on the main road, the town a long drive ahead. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me for days, but I told myself I was lucky. Whatever had been at that cabin had moved on, and I had escaped. Even now, I avoid that area entirely. I can still picture the scratches on the door, the claw marks along the wall, and the heavy prints in the dirt. I never found out exactly what it was, but I know it was real, and I know it was close. And that memory is enough to make me never return, to choose busy, crowded places instead of empty, silent woods. The cabin was abandoned in the sense that no one lived there, but it was far from empty. And some things in the forest are better left alone. I never thought a simple weekend trip to a remote cabin could turn into the kind of ordeal that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I had always considered myself prepared, cautious, someone who knew how to handle emergencies. I had planned everything in advance: maps, food, water, first aid kit, extra clothing, batteries, flashlights, a fully charged phone, even a small camping stove in case the electricity didn't work. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, but it was advertised as sturdy, isolated, and surrounded by dense woods, far from the nearest neighbor. That isolation is what had appealed to me. The idea of being alone in nature, cut off from everything, a break from work, from people, from all the noise. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I expected, winding through narrow mountain roads that twisted around sheer cliffs and thick forest. It was mid-October, the air was crisp and cool, and the trees were turning gold and red, their leaves swirling on the ground with the occasional gust of wind. The last few miles, I had to leave the main road and follow a dirt track that gradually became narrower, rougher, and almost overgrown in places. My car handled it, but I had to go very slowly, my eyes constantly scanning for rocks or fallen branches. Even then, I had to stop a couple of times to remove debris. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, the forest casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the ground. I parked my car in a small clearing near the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat sound loud. The cabin itself was modest, built from weathered logs, with a small porch and a pitched roof. A chimney hinted at a wood-burning stove inside. I carried in my bags and took a moment to look around. Beyond the clearing, the forest rose in all directions. There was a stream somewhere down the slope to the east, and I could hear the faint sound of water rushing over rocks. It all felt peaceful, beautiful, even in a way that made me almost forget why I was there, to be alone, to disconnect. I unpacked slowly, methodically, arranging things in the small kitchen and bedroom area. I made a fire in the stove and watched the flames dance, feeling a quiet satisfaction. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive, and for a while, I felt completely safe. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind or an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon rummaging through the leaves, but there was something about the pattern that didn't feel right. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone moving carefully through the underbrush. I told myself I was imagining things and eventually went back to sleep. The next morning, the forest looked different somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the quiet had a sharp edge now, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I went for a short walk, trying to calm my unease. The air was damp, the ground slippery with fallen leaves. As I followed the path down toward the stream, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints in the soft mud. They were fresh and not like any animal tracks I knew. Human, barefoot or in soft shoes. They didn't follow the path exactly. They came from the deeper woods and disappeared again into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, feeling a cold pulse of fear. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone, but the thought of someone else being this deep in the woods without telling me made me tense. I decided it was probably another hiker or a local, but still, I went back to the cabin faster than I intended. I spent the rest of the day inside, doing chores, keeping busy, trying to shake off the feeling. I checked the locks, reinforced the windows, made sure the firewood was stacked near the door. I kept my phone charged and my flashlight at the ready. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind rattling the branches, the creaking of the cabin settling, the occasional snap of a twig outside. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the darkness. I told myself it was the isolation getting to me, that my mind was playing tricks. The following morning, I went outside to fetch more wood from the pile near the cabin. I noticed my car had something odd on the windshield. Tiny scratches in a pattern, almost like someone had dragged a branch or a stone across it deliberately. I froze. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger, sharper. I spent the entire day inside, pacing, checking all the doors and windows, barricading what I could with furniture. I avoided going outside unless I had to. By the third night, I had barricaded the front door with a chair and a piece of wood, checked every lock, and kept a heavy hammer beside the bed. I could hear movement outside almost constantly, faint at first, then closer, more deliberate. Something was circling the cabin. I knew I had to do something. Staying was no longer safe. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt like a trap. I considered walking out, but the forest was dense, and I had no clear path down to the main road. My car might be safe, but if whoever or whatever was out there noticed me moving, I had no way to know what would happen. I spent the day thinking through my options, feeling my anxiety sharpen with every passing hour. I couldn't stay, and I couldn't move without risk. Late in the afternoon, I decided to try to signal for help. I had a portable emergency beacon in my bag, meant for hiking trips. I turned it on, sending a signal that should reach the local ranger station. I didn't know how long it would take, but I had no other choice. I stayed in the cabin, keeping my back to the wall, eyes on the windows, listening to the forest. Shadows moved, branches snapped, but I didn't see anyone. Hours passed slowly, every minute a struggle. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe it was an animal. But deep down, I knew the tracks, the noises, the scratches on my car. They all meant something. Around midnight, I heard something I hadn't before. A deliberate knock at the cabin door. Not a branch or a rock, a solid, hard knock. My heart raced. I gripped the hammer, every instinct screaming at me. The knocking continued, slow, measured, like someone testing my reaction. I stayed silent, barely breathing. Then, the door rattled, someone pushing against it. My first thought was to barricade further, but the chair wouldn't hold for long if they were determined. I remembered my car. I realized that if I could get to it, I might be able to drive out even if the person followed me. The cabin had no other exit except the back door, which led into the trees. I waited for a long pause, listening. The knocking had stopped. I slowly moved to the back window, peeking through the curtains. Nothing. I could barely see through the darkness, but I didn't hear anyone moving. I made a decision. I grabbed my backpack, flashlight, and the hammer, and I slipped out the back door into the woods, keeping low, moving as silently as possible. My heart pounded with every step, every broken twig beneath my foot making me flinch. The walk to the car felt endless. I kept looking back, expecting to see someone following. The forest was thick, shadows swallowing everything beyond the reach of my flashlight. When I finally reached the clearing where I parked, I nearly collapsed with relief. My car was still there, no one in sight. I threw my bag in the back seat, jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark forest, and I drove slowly at first, then faster as I got onto the dirt track. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I did, I saw the flashing lights of a ranger patrol. They had received my emergency signal and come out to check. I explained everything, showed them the tracks, the scratches, my barricades. They radioed for backup, and within the hour, a small team searched the area. No one was found. The tracks disappeared into the forest, and the cabin was empty. In the end, I never found out who had been circling the cabin or why. The rangers told me it was rare but not unheard of for someone to follow remote cabins, sometimes for robbery, sometimes worse. I left the area the next day, never returning. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched for months afterward, and I realized how naive I had been to think isolation was safe. I had planned everything, but I hadn't accounted for human unpredictability. Now, whenever I go into the woods or even a quiet area, I notice the sounds, the shadows, the small signs of movement. I always carry a signal device, and I never go alone. I still think about that cabin sometimes. The way the forest felt alive and tense, the scratches on the car, the slow, deliberate knocks. But I also think about the choices I made, the calm focus I maintained despite fear, and the fact that I survived. That survival wasn't luck alone. It was planning, awareness, and refusing to panic. The cabin taught me that the wilderness is unpredictable, but the real danger isn't the forest, it's people. I never speak of it often because it sounds strange to anyone who wasn't there. But I remember every detail, every sound, every shadow. I had been driving for hours before I even realized how far into the woods I had gone. The road had narrowed to a single lane of cracked asphalt, lined by trees that leaned inward, their branches intertwining to form a near-complete canopy overhead. The late afternoon sunlight was already starting to thin through the leaves, casting dappled, shifting shadows on the pavement. I didn't mind the isolation at first. I had always been drawn to the idea of a cabin in the woods, away from the constant noise and obligations of city life. There was a peace in the distance, a quiet I hadn't experienced in years. But that peace was fragile, delicate, and I would learn soon enough how easily it could vanish. I reached the driveway for the cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting the sky in muted streaks of orange and purple. The cabin itself looked almost smaller than I imagined, with weathered wooden panels and a steep roof coated in dark, almost black shingles. Moss clung to the corners and around the edges of the windows. A thin column of smoke rose from the stone chimney, and the scent of burning wood drifted toward me as I stepped out of my car. I had brought enough supplies for a week: canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a large flashlight with extra batteries, and a small emergency radio. I felt prepared, though I couldn't shake a quiet tension that seemed to press against my chest as I carried my bag toward the cabin door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and dust, the sort of smell that spoke of long periods of emptiness and occasional use. The living area was simple: a low couch with worn cushions, a small coffee table scarred from years of use, and a stone fireplace dominating one wall. The kitchen was functional, with a small stove, a sink, and shelves stocked with basic utensils and a few canned goods that I had brought with me. I unpacked slowly, laying my supplies on the counter and trying to imagine that I would spend the next few days in quiet solitude. The cabin's isolation was the draw, but it also carried a strange weight. In the city, you can call for help in minutes, but here, help would take hours or maybe longer. The thought was unnerving, but I brushed it aside. I told myself I had come prepared. I spent the first few hours exploring the surrounding area. The cabin sat near the edge of a small clearing that opened into a dense forest. The trees were mostly pine and birch, their trunks tall and straight. A narrow path led deeper into the woods, worn by occasional foot traffic, but I didn't follow it. I wanted to stay close to the cabin until I had established a rhythm, until I felt at home in the quiet. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The logs crackled and popped, sending up small sparks that danced in the shadows along the walls. I had brought a stack of books and a notebook, intending to read and write, but I found my mind wandering too often. The silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was a presence in itself, heavy and all-encompassing. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and at times, I could hear the faint rustle of something moving just beyond the clearing. I told myself it was probably deer or raccoons or some other small creature. Still, I could not fully shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I decided to check the cabin's water supply. There was a small pump well in the corner of the property, and I spent an hour learning its mechanics, pumping water into the containers I had brought. Everything seemed functional, and I felt a small sense of accomplishment. Later, I gathered firewood from a nearby pile left by previous occupants. It was damp in places, but I managed to select logs that would burn steadily. By mid-afternoon, I had built a substantial stack near the fireplace, and I felt more secure. It was in the late afternoon of that same day that the first real unease came. I had returned to the cabin after walking along the edge of the woods, and I noticed something odd on the path leading to the clearing. There were footprints, human footprints. They were not fresh, but they were recent enough that I could see the impressions clearly in the damp soil. My stomach tightened. I was aware that people sometimes wandered into these woods, hikers or hunters, but there was no cabin nearby except mine. My initial thought was that someone had used the path and left without my noticing. I felt relief, but it was faint, fragile. Over the next few hours, I kept checking the perimeter of the cabin. I tightened the locks on the doors and windows, made sure the flashlights were functional, and even kept a large knife on the counter. The first night after seeing the footprints, I slept very lightly, waking at every creak of the floorboards and every sudden rustle outside. By morning, I was already feeling the tension of the isolation pressing on me. The following days unfolded with a mix of mundane routine and escalating anxiety. I collected water, chopped firewood, maintained the fireplace, and attempted to occupy my mind with reading and writing. Still, the sense of being observed persisted. I noticed small things: the pattern of broken branches near the path, a single piece of trash that seemed out of place on the edge of the clearing, and the fact that my supplies seemed subtly disturbed at times. Nothing was overt, nothing that screamed danger, but my instincts told me otherwise. By the fourth night, the unease had turned into near-constant vigilance. I slept with the door locked and the knife at my side. Around midnight, I thought I heard someone walking along the path outside. I held my breath and listened, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it started. I spent the rest of the night near the window, peering into the dark forest, flashlight in hand. There was nothing, only the rustling of leaves and the occasional sound of an animal. Still, I could not shake the idea that someone had been there, that they were watching. The next morning, I decided to explore deeper into the forest, reasoning that understanding my surroundings might ease my mind. I packed a small bag with water, a map, a compass, and the knife I had been sleeping beside. I followed a narrow path that wound through the trees, careful to mark my way with small ribbons of tape so I could return. Hours passed, and I found myself in a part of the woods that was denser and darker. Fallen logs and thick underbrush made travel slow, but the quiet and isolation of the place was strangely hypnotic. It was during this trek that I found the first direct evidence that I was not entirely alone. There was a small clearing ahead, and in the center were remnants of a fire pit, recently used. Charred wood and a few scattered cans suggested someone had been there not long ago. My pulse quickened. I considered turning back, but curiosity, or perhaps a need to confront my fears, drove me closer. I noticed footprints around the pit, leading in multiple directions. Some were large, some smaller, and it was clear from the depth and shape that they belonged to different people. I took photographs with my phone, noting the patterns, and then returned to the cabin more cautiously than before. Over the next 2 days, I remained inside almost entirely, only venturing out for essential chores. Every sound seemed magnified. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, the wind gusting in sudden bursts. I installed additional locks and reinforced the windows with boards I found in the shed. I told myself I was being cautious, but the tension was exhausting. The idea that someone could enter the cabin while I slept was always present. On the 6th day, I woke to a sound that froze me completely. It was coming from outside, near the front door. The sound of a person moving through the clearing. I remained perfectly still, listening, heart pounding. Continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. I didn't dare move. I stayed in place until I could no longer hear anything. Then slowly, cautiously, I crept to the window. There was nothing to see, only shadows among the trees. My first thought was to call for help, but cell service was non-existent, and the nearest town was over an hour away. I spent the day preparing for the possibility that someone might enter the cabin. I moved heavier furniture to block the doors, gathered all tools and implements that could be used for defense, and kept the flashlight and knife on my person at all times. Night came, and I sat near the fireplace, exhausted, listening to the forest around me. Every noise made me tense. Every shadow seemed alive. At some point in the early morning, I heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. I had been caught in a sudden late-season snowfall. My first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide except the shed, which was outside and unsafe. I stayed near the center of the cabin, knife ready. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, deliberately. Then they stopped. I waited, breath shallow, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat. Hours passed. Daylight arrived. I carefully peeked outside. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been near. I was both relieved and unnerved. Whoever had been there was gone, or had been very careful to leave no trace. I resolved that I could not spend another night like that. I needed to leave, to reach civilization, to be somewhere safe. I packed my essentials quickly and quietly, leaving no trace that I had been staying in the cabin. I had been planning the trip for weeks, and when I finally drove up into the mountains and reached the cabin, I thought it would be quiet, calm, and a good chance to spend some time alone. The cabin sat near the edge of a thick forest. The road that led there was narrow and rough, and it was clear that not many people came this way. The air was cold when I stepped out of the truck, colder than I expected, and the sky had that gray, heavy look that told me the weather could change fast. I carried my bags inside, put them down near the wooden table, and stood there for a while just looking around the small room. The cabin wasn't big, only one main room and a side room that served as a bedroom, with a tiny kitchen area in one corner. The smell inside was a mix of old wood, dust, and the faint scent of smoke from the fireplace. I thought I would settle in quickly, but I felt restless as soon as I sat down. It was the kind of restlessness that comes when you're too aware of being alone, and when you notice every sound, every creak in the walls, every whistle of wind outside. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I had wanted peace and quiet, and now I had it. The cabin was far from any other houses, far from people, and I told myself that was exactly the point. That first night went slow. I made a simple meal, ate at the table while the small lamp lit up the room, then stepped outside to breathe the cold night air. The forest was dark in a way I wasn't used to. It swallowed up the light from the cabin almost instantly. I could only see a few feet beyond the porch before everything turned into a wall of black shapes. The silence was heavy. I stood there for a minute listening, and I heard only a faint rustle now and then, like something moving far away, though I couldn't tell if it was the wind or an animal. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat near the fireplace, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the windows. I kept thinking about how thin the walls were, how the glass panes didn't look very strong, and how if someone wanted to come inside, nothing much would stop them. I told myself I was overthinking. When I finally lay down on the bed, the mattress was harder than I expected. The sheets were cold, and the air seemed heavier than before. I lay there for a long time, listening to the small noises in the cabin. The roof creaked when the wind hit it. The wood popped in the fireplace as the last of the fire burned out. But after the fire died, the silence deepened. I couldn't see anything in the dark, and that's when I noticed a sound that didn't fit. It was faint, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch in the wind, but there were no trees close enough to scrape the walls. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like footsteps in the snow just outside. I froze in bed, holding my breath, waiting to hear more. The sound stopped. I lay there, staring into the dark, until my eyes hurt. Nothing else happened, and eventually I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked around outside. There were prints in the snow, faint but clear, leading around the side of the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. They circled the cabin once, then trailed off back toward the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, my stomach tight. Could have been a hunter passing by or someone hiking, I told myself. But the tracks were too close to the cabin. Whoever it was had walked right up to the walls and then circled slowly, as if looking in. I didn't like it. I told myself I wouldn't let it bother me. Still, for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the thought of someone being out there, maybe even watching from the trees. That night, I made sure every window was locked, every curtain drawn. I kept the lamp on longer than I meant to, until the smell of kerosene filled the room and my eyes stung. I turned it off and forced myself to lie down. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake, staring into the dark again, waiting for sounds. Hours passed, and then I heard it again. The same slow crunching in the snow outside. Closer this time. I sat up in bed, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps moved toward the side of the cabin, stopped near the window, and then nothing. I didn't move. My mouth was dry. Minutes dragged by. Then, so faint I almost doubted it. There was a sound against the window, like a hand brushing lightly on the glass. I wanted to look, but I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed. I lay frozen, muscles locked, staring at the black outline of the ceiling. The sound stopped, and after what felt like an hour, I heard the crunch of footsteps moving away again. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting, afraid to close my eyes. In the morning, I checked the window. There was a smudge on the glass, low and near the edge, where something or someone had touched it. I backed away from the window fast, my skin crawling. I went outside again, and sure enough, more boot prints in the snow. They came from the forest, circled the cabin again, then led back into the trees. This time they were fresher, sharper. Whoever it was had been standing there just hours earlier, close enough to touch the cabin walls, close enough to look inside. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I had a truck. I could leave if I needed to, but part of me didn't want to, felt like giving up. I told myself maybe it was a drifter passing through, maybe they wouldn't come back. I spent the day chopping wood, keeping myself busy, and every few minutes I looked toward the trees. The forest looked normal, quiet, but I felt like I was being watched. By the third night, I was wound so tight I jumped at every noise. I kept the fireplace burning brighter, as if the extra light would make me feel safer. But late into the night, I heard it again. The footsteps, slow, steady, circling the cabin. This time they didn't stop at one lap. They went around twice, then 3 times, each step deliberate, as if whoever it was wanted me to hear. I gripped the edge of the bed, waiting, sweat cold on my back. The steps stopped near the door. Silence. Then the sound of the doorknob, faint, rattling slightly. I had locked it, but the sound still froze me. The knob stopped turning, and the silence pressed in hard. I sat there all night, eyes fixed on the door, until the gray light of morning finally seeped through the curtains. When I went outside that morning, the prints at the door were deep, clear. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time. I stared at the forest, but it gave nothing back, just dark trunks and snow. I thought about leaving right then, but stubbornness, or maybe fear of what it meant to admit I was scared, kept me there. I told myself one more night, just one, then I'd pack up and go. That evening, the air grew colder, sharper, and the sky looked heavy with snow. I built the fire higher, stacked wood inside so I wouldn't have to go out, and tried to read an old book I found on the shelf, but my eyes never stayed on the page. Every little sound made me glance at the windows. The silence felt different, thicker, as if it were waiting. When the footsteps came that night, they came faster. Not a slow circle this time, but quick crunches in the snow, moving around the cabin, back and forth. I stood in the middle of the room, too scared to sit, listening as they moved from one wall to the next. Then came a new sound, a heavy thud, like a shoulder or body hitting the wall. The cabin shuddered faintly with each impact. Then the doorknob rattled again, harder this time. I backed toward the fireplace, heart racing, eyes darting between the door and the windows. The sounds went on for what felt like forever. Footsteps, thuds, rattling, then sudden silence. I didn't move. I stood there gripping a piece of wood like a weapon, staring at the door. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, from the back of the cabin, glass shattered. One of the windows. I spun toward the sound, blood pounding in my ears. The cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of snow and pine. I ran to the bedroom, slammed the door, and pushed the bed against it. I crouched in the dark corner, holding the wood, every muscle tight. I heard more footsteps inside now. Slow, steady, moving across the floor of the main room. The creak of the boards, the sound of something being dragged faintly, then silence again. I stayed in the corner, barely breathing, waiting for the door to the bedroom to move, waiting for the knob to turn. Hours passed, or maybe it just felt that way. Finally, as the faint light of dawn came through the cracks, I realized the sounds had stopped. When I finally pushed the bed aside and opened the door, the main room was empty. The window was broken wide, snow blowing in across the floor. But on the table, in the middle of the room, was something that hadn't been there before. A small knife, old, rusted, its handle worn smooth. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay another second. I grabbed my bag, shoved it into the truck, and drove down the mountain road without looking back. The trees closed in on either side, and I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the... I never expected a weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods to turn into something that would haunt me for months afterward, though not in any way people usually imagine. There were no ghosts, no curses, no creatures lurking in the shadows. The terror came from the pure, raw unpredictability of being alone in a place completely isolated from the world. A place where every sound, every shadow, and every movement had a meaning I couldn't always understand. The cabin was tucked away deep in the mountains, far from the small town where I had rented it. The directions were vague, scribbled on a scrap of paper by the owner who lived miles away. The last stretch of road was unpaved, more a dirt path than anything else, lined with tall, dense pine trees that blocked out the sky in certain areas. I remember the moment I turned onto that path, the sunlight filtering through the needles in long streaks that looked beautiful at first, but as the miles passed, the beauty started to feel heavy and oppressive. The isolation settled over me like a wet blanket. I tried to tell myself that was what I wanted, what I needed. A break from the city, from the constant buzz of notifications, the endless chatter of people who seemed to demand attention just by existing. I wanted silence, and I was getting it in the purest, most suffocating form. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to drop behind the hills. The cabin was small, made of rough logs with a slanted roof and a thin chimney. Smoke stains on the logs suggested it had been used in winter, and though the place looked sturdy, I noticed the windows didn't seem very well sealed. I shrugged it off, telling myself it added charm. Inside, the air was cool and musty. Dust coated the wooden floorboards, and the smell of old wood mixed with faint traces of something I couldn't place, something earthy, almost like damp soil or rotting leaves. The furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed with a faded mattress, and a wood-burning stove. There was a bucket in one corner labeled for water, and a stack of firewood near the stove. A small window over the kitchen area let in the last bits of daylight. I set down my bag, looking around. The cabin was quiet in a way that pressed against your ears. Not the peaceful quiet I had imagined, but a quiet that demanded attention, that made every creak and groan of the wooden structure feel unnervingly loud. I lit a fire in the stove to chase away the chill, though I wasn't cold in any real sense, just uncomfortable, aware of the stillness around me. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and every few minutes a twig would snap. First, I thought nothing of it. The woods are full of animals, deer, rabbits, foxes. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice patterns that didn't make sense. A snapping twig here, a rustle there, always nearby, always just beyond sight. I kept peering through the window, half expecting to see something, anything, but the shadows of the trees seemed to twist with the wind. I tried to laugh it off. I told myself I was imagining it, that the city had dulled my instincts, and now that I was somewhere my senses had to work, every little noise seemed amplified, a threat where none existed. Night fell fully. I ate some canned food I had brought, heated over the stove. The smell of the food masked the dampness in the cabin. But even as I ate, I couldn't ignore the noises. I could hear them most clearly when I lay down on the bed. The cabin groaned in ways that didn't match the outside wind, subtle movements, like the building itself was settling, but too consistent to be random. Every so often, I thought I heard a footstep, soft, deliberate, approaching the cabin. I kept checking the windows, but nothing was ever there. No deer, no fox, no one. Just shadows moving, bending with the wind. Sleep came fitfully. I woke several times to the sound of something outside, too quiet for any animal, too steady for the wind. I began to think about the path that had brought me here, how easy it would be for someone to follow it without me knowing. The thought made my stomach knot. I told myself I had locked the door. The lock was old and simple, but it worked. Yet even as I repeated that, I realized the lock didn't feel like enough. In my mind, I began running through scenarios. Someone cutting the power, someone approaching the cabin silently, waiting for me to drop my guard. It was absurd, and yet my body reacted as if it were possible. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't read. I could only stare at the shadows outside, counting every flicker, every movement. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones. I forced myself to eat another small breakfast and step outside. The air was crisp, the sun rising slowly behind the hills, painting the forest in pale gold. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, examining every tree, every brush, every possible place someone could hide. I found nothing, nothing that suggested I wasn't alone. And yet, the fear didn't leave. Pressed against me like a living thing, I felt watched. I felt something had entered my space the night before, moved through the shadows, and now lingered just out of sight, just out of reach. I kept checking my phone, hoping for signal, but there was none. No bars, no service, just the silence of the mountains. The next day, I tried to force myself into normalcy. I chopped more firewood, stacked it neatly by the stove. I cleaned the cabin, swept dust, wiped down counters. I thought I was calming my mind, that by doing something practical, I could convince myself the threat wasn't real. But even while working, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air was heavy with attention. A constant awareness that I was being observed, even though I couldn't see anyone. Every rustle of the trees, every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind became a potential sign of intrusion. My muscles tensed continuously. My sleep was shallow. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just at the edge of the tree line, waiting, patient, silent. I didn't see them, and maybe they weren't there, but the thought felt as real as any object in the cabin. By the third day, I started noticing small things that unsettled me even more. The firewood I had stacked neatly seemed slightly disturbed each morning, as if someone had nudged it. Tiny footprints, maybe animal tracks, were outside the door, but sometimes they didn't match anything I could recognize. They weren't human, not exactly, not animal either. Something had brushed against the cabin at night. Something had left subtle traces, enough to make me question whether I was imagining it or not. I didn't dare leave the cabin for a long walk. Even looking out the window became a careful, tense act. Every shadow could hide someone. Every brush of wind against a branch could be a footstep. The line between real and imagined fear was blurring. By the fourth day, I decided I needed to do something practical. I packed a bag, gathered the essentials, my phone, a first aid kit, the map, food, water. I left the cabin and started walking down the dirt path, determined to reach the nearest town. The air was sharp with the cold, and the sunlight was weak through the thick canopy of trees. Every so often, I would hear a twig snap behind me. My heart jumped every time. I didn't dare look back at first, just kept walking, fast, with a rhythm I couldn't break. After 10 minutes, I turned and saw nothing. Nothing but the woods. And yet, the feeling didn't leave. Something had been there. Something had been following, and it might still be there. I quickened my pace, my backpack heavy, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The path twisted and turned, the trees dense, and my fear growing with every step. I remembered that I hadn't told anyone I was coming. No one knew the cabin's location. I was utterly alone. Panic bubbled in my chest. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was likely just the forest, just wildlife, just imagination. But I couldn't shake the sense that the cabin had made me vulnerable, that the remoteness that drew me there also trapped me there, isolated, exposed. By mid-afternoon, I saw the first signs of the road I had driven in on. Gravel replaced dirt. Sunlight broke fully through the trees. Relief surged in me, sharp and sudden, washing away most of the tension that had gripped me for days. I kept moving, careful, but no longer paralyzed by fear. Eventually, I reached the small town where I had rented the cabin. I told the owner everything. The noises, the tracks, the disturbances, the sense of being watched. They listened, expression neutral, and said nothing had ever been reported. No one had ever had a problem. Perhaps that was supposed to reassure me. Perhaps it did, in a way. I felt foolish in retrospect, but I also felt a deep, simmering respect for the isolation of that place, and a profound understanding of how thin the line is between solitude and fear. I returned home the next day, exhausted, wary of silence, of shadows, of spaces where nothing moved. And in the weeks that followed, I found myself replaying the experience over and over, analyzing every noise, every movement, every moment of tension. I understood then, more. I had always thought that escaping to a cabin in the woods would be a kind of therapy. I imagined myself sitting by a fireplace, the wind howling outside, drinking coffee in the early morning while sunlight trickled through frost-covered windows. I imagined the woods as comforting, familiar, a place where I could think without distractions, a place where I could be entirely alone. That was the idea, at least when I rented the cabin. It was an old, weathered structure, standing on the edge of a dense forest with a small dirt road leading up to it. The cabin was not luxurious, and it certainly did not appear in any glossy magazine. Its wood was darkened and rough from years of weather, the shingles were uneven, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. Still, it had character. Inside, the walls were paneled with pine. The floors creaked in ways that made me notice each step I took, and a stone fireplace dominated the main room. There were a few basic pieces of furniture: a worn-out couch, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed in a separate bedroom. The kitchen was tiny, equipped with a small stove, a fridge that hummed louder than it probably should, and a sink that dripped faintly when I turned off the tap. I arrived in late afternoon, the sky already beginning to dim, and the temperature had dropped sharply. The sun vanished behind tall, thick trees, leaving long shadows across the yard. I carried my bag up the narrow path, trying not to trip over the exposed roots and uneven stones. The air smelled like wet soil and pine needles, sharp and fresh. The quiet was immediate and heavy, the kind that presses on your ears until you notice your own heartbeat. Inside the cabin, I unpacked quickly. I didn't want to linger outside because the cold air made the hairs on my arms stand up. I started a fire in the fireplace, though it took more effort than I expected. The logs were damp, and the matches kept breaking. Eventually, I managed a small flame that grew into a fire crackling with heat and smoke curling into the chimney. I took off my jacket, ran a hand over the wood-paneled walls, and tried to convince myself that I was safe. That first night, I stayed awake longer than I should have. The darkness outside felt alive in a way that was different from the city. The wind rattled the windows, and I could hear branches tapping against the cabin walls. Every little sound made me tense. Somewhere far in the woods, I thought I heard a low, distant howl, though I couldn't tell if it was an animal or just the wind playing tricks. I had packed a flashlight, so I kept it on the table beside me, just in case. Sleep came eventually, though it was fitful. I dreamed of shadows moving in the woods, of the floorboards creaking under invisible footsteps, of the trees bending unnaturally close to the cabin, as if leaning in to watch me. When I woke, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long golden streaks through the windows. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the warmth from the fireplace wash over me, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders. I spent the next day exploring the surroundings. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, and beyond it, there were patches of moss-covered rock and a small stream that wound its way through the trees. The dirt road I had driven in on continued farther into the forest but became almost invisible after a short distance, swallowed by the undergrowth. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of recent human activity, just the tracks of animals in the mud. I noticed deer prints, small fox tracks, and the unmistakable marks of raccoons near the stream. It was beautiful in a raw, wild way, but there was an undercurrent of isolation that gnawed at the edges of my mind. That night, I decided to make a proper fire and settle in early. I had brought books and a notebook, intending to write and relax. The fire took hold faster this time, and the cabin filled with the soft orange glow of flames. Outside, the wind had picked up. It rattled the windows with a more urgent force, shaking the cabin in ways that made me grip the edge of the table. Around midnight, I heard something unusual. It was not the wind, not the trees. It was a scraping sound, soft but deliberate, like claws or a branch being dragged across wood. Came from the side of the cabin, near the kitchen window. I froze, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. I wanted to dismiss it. Maybe it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. I reached for the flashlight, shaking, and went to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the yard. Nothing moved. I lowered the flashlight, but my ears strained to catch any sound. A few minutes later, the noise returned, this time from the front porch. A slow, dragging scrape across the wood. I thought about calling someone, but there was no cell signal here. The nearest town was miles away, and even if I could call, who would I call it to in the morning for some noise in the woods? I decided to stay near the fireplace, where the fire gave me some sense of security. I grabbed a kitchen knife, sharp and heavy, and sat with my back against the wall, listening. The scraping continued intermittently, moving around the cabin, sometimes from the side, sometimes from the back, sometimes near the front porch. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare. My mind raced through every possibility. Animals, human trespassers, branches blown by the wind, old cabin noises, the imagination playing tricks. I couldn't tell which was real. At some point, the scraping stopped. I sat frozen, staring into the fire, listening to the quiet that followed, which felt thicker and heavier than the previous noise. Morning brought some relief. The wind had died down, the sun was shining, and the cabin felt warmer. I stepped outside to inspect the perimeter. The yard was mostly undisturbed, except for faint, large footprints in the dirt near the front porch. I stopped when I saw them. They were not deer or raccoon tracks. They were human, sizable, roughly 8 or 9 inches long, with a wide soul and deep impressions. My stomach turned. Whoever had been here last night had left no other traces, no dropped items, no signs of lingering beyond those tracks. They seemed to have come close enough to the cabin to make the noise I had heard and then disappeared into the woods. I considered leaving immediately, but it was a 30-minute drive to the nearest paved road, and the forest stretched far in every direction. I decided to stay cautiously and prepare better for potential threats. I checked all the locks on the windows and doors, although most were old and didn't fully close. I barricaded the front door with a heavy chair and stacked firewood against the side windows. I made sure to keep my knife and a small hatchet near me at all times. The next day, I explored further, trying to calm my mind with distraction. I followed the stream deeper into the forest. The air was cool and damp, filled with the smell of wet leaves and moss. Sunlight flickered through the canopy, casting patterns on the ground. I felt a strange mix of awe and unease, beautiful, but unnervingly silent. The deeper I went, the more I noticed signs of animal life. Bird calls, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, the occasional glimpse of a deer. But there were also signs of human presence. Broken branches at waist height, scuffed patches of earth, and faint, almost indistinguishable footprints. I couldn't tell if they were old or new. That night, the scraping returned. I was prepared this time. I had placed chairs against all entrances, lined up firewood in front of the windows, and kept the fireplace roaring. The sound started at the back, a slow, deliberate drag across the wood. I gripped my knife, every muscle tense, and waited. It moved to the side, then to the front porch. I realized then that whatever it was, it knew the cabin's layout. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. Hours passed. The noise stopped again. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I took turns staring out the windows and checking the locks, trying to make sense of what was happening. I made plans in my head for escape routes, memorized the way to the nearest road, thought about how I would move silently, quietly, without drawing attention. By dawn, I was shaking, not from the cold but from tension and fear. The following day, I decided to investigate further, to confront whatever had been circling the cabin. I left the knife and hatchet inside and took only my small pack with water, snacks, and a flashlight. I walked carefully along the perimeter, following the tracks I had seen the first morning. They led into the woods, deeper than I had ventured before. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves, and the forest seemed to close around me, muffling the sounds from the cabin. I followed the tracks for a long time, careful not to make noise, but they disappeared suddenly, as if whoever had made them had vanished. I returned to the cabin feeling unnerved but oddly relieved. I reinforced the barricades, stocked more firewood, and decided I would spend one more night and then leave. That night, the noise did not return. I slept a little, though lightly, on the couch near the fireplace, with the hatchet under my arm. Morning brought clarity. I decided I would leave immediately after breakfast. I had decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin that sat deep inside the woods, far from the nearest town. It was supposed to be a quiet break, away from everything, a place where I could breathe without the constant noise of people, cars, and screens. The cabin wasn't mine, but it belonged to a distant relative who barely used it anymore. He had told me it was old but sturdy, with a wood stove, a couple of rooms, and no modern luxuries except for running water from a well pump and a small propane generator. That idea of being away from everything felt like something I needed. The road to the cabin was nothing more than a narrow gravel path that turned into dirt as I drove deeper. The forest seemed to swallow the road. Branches leaned across above me, and my car felt smaller and weaker the farther I went. There were no other cars, no other homes, no sign of life except for the endless trees. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the first thing that struck me was how silent it was. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels peaceful. It was heavy, like the woods themselves were pressing against me, holding in every sound. The cabin looked exactly like I had been told. A small rectangle of weathered wood, a pitched roof covered in moss, and a single front porch with steps that creaked when I walked up. The windows were dusty, and the lock on the door looked old but strong. I unloaded my things quickly, carrying bags of food, some clothes, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a small axe. The cabin had no phone service. The last bar on my phone had disappeared about 10 miles back. I knew I was cut off, but I had told myself that was the point. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood and dust. The air was colder than I expected. A stove sat against one wall, an old iron thing that would need firewood to keep the place warm. The furniture was basic: a table, 2 chairs, a couch with a faded cover, and a narrow bed in the back room. I checked all the windows to make sure they could lock. They did, though the latches felt a bit weak. I lit the stove and watched the first smoke curl up through the pipe. The warmth spread slowly, and the place began to feel less empty. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food on a small gas burner I had brought, read a book by lantern light, and listened to the sounds outside. The woods weren't silent anymore. As darkness fell, I could hear wind brushing through the trees, branches snapping somewhere far off, and the faint call of an owl. But even then, something about it felt strange. The noises didn't sound natural in rhythm. It was as if they were too spaced out, almost deliberate. I brushed it off as my mind adjusting to the isolation. I wasn't used to being this cut off. I went to bed early, pulling a blanket around me as the cold settled in again. The forest outside seemed alive, but I forced myself to ignore it. By the second day, I began to notice things that unsettled me more. When I went outside to gather some wood for the stove, I saw what looked like footprints in the soft dirt near the side of the cabin. At first, I assumed they were mine from unloading the car, but when I looked closer, they didn't match my boots. They were larger, heavier, and the stride was wider. I told myself it could have been an old hunter or someone passing through long before I arrived. But the soil was damp from rain 2 nights ago, and the prints looked fresh. That afternoon, while walking about 50 yards from the cabin to stretch my legs, I saw movement between the trees. It wasn't clear, just a shape that seemed to shift quickly out of view. I froze, staring, waiting for it to appear again. Nothing. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the woods, but only the stillness returned. I walked back quickly, feeling an unease crawl into me. By evening, I decided to double-check the locks on the doors and windows. The cabin had only 2 exterior doors, the main one at the front and a smaller one at the back that led to a tiny porch facing the thicker part of the woods. I latched them both tightly and closed the curtains. The night was harder. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first, it was just the usual creaks of the cabin cooling, the stove faintly popping as the firewood inside shifted. But then I began to hear something else. Soft, deliberate crunches in the dirt outside, moving slowly around the cabin. I held my breath, listening harder. The steps would pause, then resume. At one point, they seemed to stop just outside the back door. I stayed still, gripping the blanket. My flashlight was within reach on the nightstand. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded away. I barely slept. In the morning, I forced myself to believe it was an animal. A deer maybe, or even a bear. The woods were full of them, after all. Still, when I went outside, I saw the prints again, clearer this time. Not animal, definitely human, and they circled the cabin. My chest tightened as I stared at them, realizing they weren't random. Whoever it was had walked completely around, close to the walls, as if inspecting every side. The day passed with me on edge. I didn't go far, and I kept the axe nearby at all times. I tried to distract myself with small chores, chopping some firewood, boiling water from the pump, writing a few notes in a journal I had brought. But every time I glanced out the window, I felt like something was watching from between the trees. That night was worse, much worse. I heard it again. Footsteps closer, slower. I turned off the lantern, sitting in complete darkness, holding the axe across my lap. The cabin felt like it was breathing with me, every creak amplified. At one point, I heard the back doorknob rattle, just a slight jiggle as if someone was testing it. My throat went dry, and I didn't move a muscle. It rattled again, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. Hours crawled by. Every sound outside made me twitch. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a light, broken sleep. The morning light didn't bring much comfort. When I stepped outside, the prints were there again, more of them, overlapping, circling. The back door had fresh scratches near the lock, shallow but noticeable. Someone had tried to pry it open during the night. My stomach twisted. I knew I had two choices. I could pack my things, drive back down the dirt road, and leave. Or I could stay, lock the place down, and wait it out. Part of me thought leaving would be safest, but the other part reminded me how far the nearest town was. If someone was out here watching me, they could easily follow me on that long, narrow road. I felt trapped either way. That day, I barely left the cabin. I sat near the front window, looking out, gripping the axe, waiting for movement. Every shadow between the trees felt alive. I barely ate. The silence outside pressed harder than ever, broken only by the occasional distant crack of a branch. When night came, my nerves were already shredded. I kept the lantern low, every curtain drawn, both doors bolted. The footsteps came again, but this time they didn't circle. They came straight to the back door. The knob rattled harder, then a loud push thudded against the wood. I gripped the axe so tight my hand ached. The sound stopped, but I could hear breathing outside. Slow, heavy breaths. I didn't dare move. Minutes dragged on. Then, faintly, the sound of retreating steps. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting, certain they would return. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, shoving everything into bags, keeping the axe in one hand. When I stepped outside, the woods felt even heavier. The prints were everywhere, crisscrossing, circling again and again. Whoever it was had spent hours outside while I sat inside trying not to breathe too loud. I loaded the car as fast as I could, eyes darting to the tree line. At one point, I swore I saw a figure standing between the pines, still and dark. My heart pounded so hard it shook my whole body. I slammed the trunk, jumped in, and started the engine. Gravel spun under the tires as I pulled away. The drive out was the longest of my life. Every bend in the road, every stretch of trees, I expected to see someone step out. My hands gripped the wheel so hard they hurt. After nearly an hour, the dirt turned back to gravel, then to pavement. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never saw anyone directly. Never a face, never a word spoken. Just prints, scratches, sounds in the night. But I know someone was out there. They watched me, circled me, tested my doors, and waited. I don't know what they wanted, but I know if I had stayed one more night, they might have gotten inside. I never went back to that cabin. I had been driving for hours through the winding back roads of the forested mountains, the kind of roads that were barely wide enough for two cars and surrounded by dense trees that blocked out the sun in places, leaving patches of shadow and light on the asphalt. I wasn't in a rush. This trip had been something I'd been planning for months. A solitary weekend away from work, from phones, from anyone else. A chance to disappear into the silence of the wilderness and just exist without interruption. I had a map of the area, though I mostly relied on memory and the faintly scrawled directions the cabin owner had emailed me weeks earlier. They had insisted that cell service was spotty at best, but I liked that. The idea of being unreachable was part of the draw. The last mile to the cabin felt like it went on forever. The paved road turned into dirt, rutted and uneven, and my car bounced over rocks and roots. I could see the edges of the forest closing in around me, trees leaning over the road like they were watching. I noticed that I hadn't seen another car for a long time, not a single one, not even tire tracks newer than my own. That made me a little uneasy, but I told myself it was just a remote area. That was the point. When I finally pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, I felt a mix of relief and a creeping unease. The cabin was a simple wooden structure, not particularly large but sturdy looking. It had a porch that wrapped around two sides, and a small stack of firewood neatly piled beside it. The windows were clean, and the door had a key lock rather than a combination, which made me feel slightly more secure. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint rush of water. I guessed there was a stream nearby. I unloaded my car slowly, taking care not to make too much noise, though there was no one around to hear me. Everything felt quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your thoughts louder than they should be. I carried in my backpack and cooler, locked the car, and stepped onto the porch. The floorboards creaked under my weight, reminding me of the cabin's age, and I wondered how long it had been there, standing alone in the forest. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood polish and old furniture. The floor was wooden, worn smooth by years of use, and the furniture was simple but solid. A table, a few chairs, a small bed in the corner with a thick quilt folded neatly at the foot. There was a wood-burning stove, which I planned to use that evening. I set down my things and began unpacking slowly, methodically, as I always did. The routine helped me settle, gave me a sense of control in the vast wilderness around me. I checked the windows. All were intact and locked. The door was solid, and though it looked old, it felt secure. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like the forest outside was holding its breath and waiting. I shook it off. I had read about cabin isolation anxiety. It was normal. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows in the room stretched and shifted. I lit the stove and the fire crackled, warming the cabin in a way that made it feel less intimidating. I made myself a simple dinner, using the supplies I had brought, and tried to focus on the simple comfort of eating in silence, the only sounds being the wind outside and the occasional snap of a tree branch against the cabin. After cleaning up, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the last light of day filter through the trees. That's when I noticed it. A figure moving far in the distance along the tree line, too slow to be a deer, too human to be anything else. My first thought was that it was someone else who had rented the cabin or a hiker, but the forest was thick, and it was odd that I hadn't heard footsteps or rustling earlier. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared. I went back inside and locked the door, checking the windows again. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified. I sat in a chair near the stove, trying to ignore the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching. My mind began running through scenarios, from the most realistic to the worst case, and I realized that the realistic ones were enough to scare me. A squatter, a hunter, someone with ill intent. It was a lonely cabin, miles from the nearest road, and no one would pass by to notice me if something went wrong. Night fell completely, and with it came an oppressive darkness. I could barely make out the edges of the trees through the windows. I had a flashlight and a small camping knife on the table beside me, but it felt inadequate. Every crack, every groan of the wood, every rustle outside made me tense. I thought about the figure I had seen earlier. Maybe it was just a hiker who had gotten lost, or maybe it had been a trick of my eyes. But my gut told me it was neither. I tried to sleep, but the dark pressed down on me, heavier than any pillow. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint tapping at the door. My heart jumped. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. Another tap. I grabbed the flashlight and approached the door slowly, careful not to make a sound. I shone the beam outside. Nothing. No one. Only the trees, swaying faintly in the wind. I convinced myself it had been an animal, a branch knocking against the door. But the tapping continued intermittently, always light, deliberate, like someone testing the locks. I went to the windows, checked every corner of the cabin. Nothing. I felt trapped in my own paranoia. My phone had no signal, so calling for help wasn't an option. Morning brought light and, with it, a semblance of relief. The tapping had stopped, and I spent the day doing what I could to feel normal. Chopping firewood, walking around the perimeter of the cabin, and making sure all doors and windows were secure. I realized that I hadn't seen the figure again, and that maybe it had only been my imagination, amplified by isolation. But the feeling of being watched persisted. The next night, the tapping returned, more insistent this time. I stayed up until dawn, flashlight in hand, checking every sound, every shadow. I realized then that it wasn't just isolation anxiety. Whoever or whatever had been out there knew I was alone. The forest, once inviting, now felt like it had become a cage, enclosing me in a space where no one could hear my calls, no one could come to my aid. On the third day, I knew I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to confront whatever it was. I packed a small bag with essentials: food, water, the knife, the flashlight, and a few items of clothing. I left the cabin quietly, making my way down the dirt road, every step tense, every sound amplified. I was careful to stay off the main path, hoping to avoid whoever might be watching. Hours passed. I kept moving, navigating the familiar map I had memorized, until I finally reached a main road. Relief flooded me as I saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. I told them my story in brief, careful not to exaggerate, and they agreed to take me to the nearest town where I could call the authorities. When the police arrived later at the cabin, they found nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry, no tracks apart from mine. But I knew what I had seen, and more importantly, what I had felt. Alone in that remote cabin, the forest had transformed into something dangerous, something that preyed on my solitude. In the end, I never returned to that cabin. I sold the property, using the experience as a cautionary tale about the allure of isolation. But the memory stayed with me, the oppressive quiet, the deliberate tapping, the figure in the trees, and it changed the way I approached solitude. I no longer romanticized it. Solitude could be beautiful, but it could also be terrifying, and sometimes the forest itself felt alive in ways you couldn't predict or control. I had been planning the cabin trip for months, meticulously organizing every detail. I wanted to escape the endless hum of the city, the constant buzz of traffic, and the blinding neon lights. I imagined myself surrounded by the silence of nature, the trees swaying in the wind, the occasional distant call of a bird, and the quiet rustle of leaves under my boots. The cabin I rented was far off the main roads, tucked into a dense forest where the GPS signal flickered at best. The idea of solitude excited me, even if it was slightly unnerving. I convinced myself that this trip would be rejuvenating, a chance to reconnect with the quiet that I had almost forgotten existed. The journey there was long. I drove for hours along winding roads, each mile peeling away a layer of city noise. I noticed the air getting cleaner, crisper, and cooler. Occasionally, a deer would dart across the road, and I'd brake sharply, heart pounding from the sudden rush. The landscape changed slowly at first, with fields dotted with farmhouses, but gradually the trees grew taller and closer together. The road narrowed into a single lane, flanked by dense woods. My car headlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I told myself it was just my imagination. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cabin was modest: weathered wood, small porch, a stone chimney that promised warmth, but solid. It was surrounded by tall pine and oak trees, the forest thick and unbroken. There was no other house in sight, no faint glow of a distant light. My first thought was relief. My second was a creeping, indistinct unease. I parked the car, unpacked my things, and took in the quiet. It was absolute, a silence so profound it felt almost physical, pressing against my ears. Even the wind seemed cautious, only whispering through the leaves. Inside, the cabin smelled of aged wood and faintly of smoke, probably from previous occupants. It had all I needed: a small kitchen, a sleeping loft, and a living area with a wood stove. I set my things down, lit the stove, and settled into a routine of preparing a simple meal and organizing my supplies. The first night passed with an almost surreal calm. The only sounds were the occasional crack of the stove and the rustle of leaves outside. I felt safe despite the remoteness. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense but navigable. I found a narrow stream that wound through the trees, its water clear and cold. I followed it for a while, noticing animal tracks in the mud. Rabbits, deer, something larger that I couldn't identify. I felt a primal alertness, the kind that comes when you are aware of being watched, though I knew no one was there. The sun was bright. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and the forest felt timeless. I returned to the cabin before nightfall, bringing firewood and making sure everything was secure. The third day, things started to feel different. I noticed subtle shifts I couldn't quite name. The wind seemed to change direction suddenly, rustling branches in ways that didn't match the current. I heard distant snaps of twigs that weren't along the paths I had taken. At first, I dismissed it as animals, maybe a deer or a bear moving in the distance. But there was a consistency to the sounds, a rhythm that made me pause each time I heard it. It wasn't immediate danger, just presence. I felt it watching, though I could see nothing. By the fourth day, the quiet began to feel oppressive. The isolation, which had once been comforting, started pressing against me. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a possible threat. When I stepped outside, I constantly scanned the trees, feeling exposed despite being alone. I noticed that footprints in the dirt around the cabin didn't match mine. I had been meticulous about observing where I walked, so I knew these weren't mine, nor had I seen any animals leave prints like these. I traced them carefully. They were human, small but deliberate. They didn't belong to me, and they led no obvious direction into the forest. Panic flickered briefly, but I forced myself to remain calm. Perhaps someone else had been here recently, I thought. Perhaps a hiker, a hunter. The rational side of my mind clung to these explanations, but deep down, my body was tense, alert. I double-checked the cabin doors and windows, reinforced the locks, and made sure the stove could serve as a makeshift barricade if necessary. That night, I barely slept, listening to the forest, each crack of a branch triggering a surge of adrenaline. By the early morning, I was exhausted but also hyper-aware. I noticed the footprints again. They hadn't moved, but more had appeared overnight, closer to the cabin. Someone had been circling me. The fifth day, I decided to stay put. I kept the doors locked, the windows tightly shut. I stayed near the stove, keeping a fire going, preparing simple meals. Every so often, I would glance outside, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. The footprints were there, unmistakable, and at times I glimpsed movement. Something between the trees, just out of focus, disappearing when I looked directly. I realized I was being stalked, though I had no idea by whom or why. Fear gnawed at me, cold and persistent. By the sixth day, I began planning an exit strategy. I couldn't leave the car overnight. It would be discovered, and whoever was out there might follow me. I needed supplies, I needed information. I spent hours reinforcing doors, creating a signal fire in case someone came near, and mapping a possible escape through the denser parts of the forest. I stayed vigilant, eating very little, sleeping in short bursts. The isolation combined with the fear started breaking me down. I was aware of every sound, every shadow, every movement outside the cabin, and I noticed that the sounds were changing. Heavy footsteps, dragging sounds, slow and methodical. I realized that whatever was out there was learning, adapting to me. On the seventh day, I saw a figure clearly. At first, I thought it was a tree, then a shadow, then a human. Someone crouching among the trees, watching. My heart hammered, but I didn't panic yet. I grabbed a heavy stick from inside the cabin, silently moving to the window. The figure didn't move, just watched. I could see them now, faintly in the dim light, too far to identify features but close enough to confirm my fear. My mind raced. This was no random hiker. This was deliberate. Someone had been tracking me, studying me. I realized then that I had underestimated my vulnerability. The isolation that I had sought was a trap. I made a decision. I could not stay here any longer. I packed essentials, water, food, my backpack, and waited for darkness. I observed the figure moving slightly, not approaching, but not leaving either. When night fell completely, I slipped out a back window, careful not to make noise, keeping low and moving away from the cabin. The forest was familiar now from my explorations, but shadows seemed to have multiplied, creating obstacles I had never noticed before. Every step was a balance between speed and stealth. I navigated through dense underbrush, listening for movement behind me. The forest was alive with noise. Birds, insects, the wind. but I strained to hear anything unusual. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed the figure again, always just beyond clear view. Hours passed. Exhaustion weighed on me, but stopping was not an option. I knew I had to reach a main road, any road, to ensure I could escape. The night stretched endlessly, the darkness dense, almost tactile. At last, I stumbled onto a dirt road, the first human-made surface I had seen since arriving. Relief flooded me, but I didn't stop. I moved quickly along the road until I saw the faint lights of a small town in the distance. I ran toward it, lungs burning, eyes stinging from fatigue. Finally, I reached the edge of town, flagged down a car, and explained my situation as best I could. The driver listened, shocked, and called the local authorities. The next day, a search team returned to the cabin. They found nothing unusual inside, no sign of forced entry. Around the cabin, though, the tracks were unmistakable, small, deliberate footprints circling the structure, leading into the dense woods. There was no indication of who they belonged to, and no one had reported anyone missing in the area. The cabin itself, once my sanctuary, was now a symbol of the fine line between solitude and exposure. I didn't return to the cabin. The memory of that week remained vivid, the fear tangible even months later. I found solace in the fact that I had escaped without confrontation, that my vigilance and planning had kept me safe. But I also understood something deeper about isolation, about the forest, about being alone in a place that offers no witnesses. Nature was indifferent, but humans could be dangerous in ways that made you question your assumptions. And sometimes the scariest thing was not what you saw, but what you knew was watching. The experience changed me. I came to the cabin to be alone for a while. It was early autumn, the air cool but not yet cold, and I thought a week in the woods would be the kind of quiet break I needed. The cabin sat about 6 miles from the main road, tucked between pines and birches, on the edge of a small lake that reflected the gray sky. It was not my cabin, but a friend's, who said I could use it whenever I wanted. The place had no neighbors close by, just thick forest all around and a narrow gravel road that ended near the porch. The nearest town was about 40 minutes away by car. When I arrived, the air smelled damp, like wet leaves, and the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was darkened from years of weather, the roof sagged a little, and the windows were streaked. But it was dry inside, and it felt tucked away, cut off from everything. That was exactly what I wanted. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked food, water, and some supplies I had brought. The cabin had no electricity, only a small generator for emergencies, which I didn't plan to use. The water pump worked, though the flow was weak, and there was a wood stove for heat. I stacked logs near it and swept some cobwebs from the corners. At night, I lit a lantern and read for a while before stretching out on the old bed. It felt good to lie there with nothing but silence around me. No traffic, no voices, just the sound of trees shifting outside. The second day, I took a walk by the lake. The water was low, showing muddy edges with deer tracks pressed into them. The air was colder that morning, the kind that nips at your ears and makes your breath show. I followed the shoreline for a while, noticing the quiet again. No boats, no people, not even many birds. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the leaves. That night, I cooked some rice and beans on a small camp stove. When I stepped out onto the porch afterward, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, darker, and I had the strange sense of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the deep quiet. But I stayed out there only a minute before heading back inside and sliding the wooden latch across the door. By the third day, the weather had shifted. A thin drizzle fell most of the afternoon, making the woods darker and quieter. I spent time chopping more wood and carrying it inside. I noticed then that some of the stacked logs on the side of the cabin had been moved. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, but the logs weren't knocked over. They were pulled out, set aside, almost like someone had been picking through them. I tried to shake it off, but it left me unsettled. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening. The forest makes noises, branches cracking, leaves rustling, animals moving. But I kept hearing faint, steady sounds, not random. A slow crunch of footsteps on the wet ground, then silence. Then again closer. I held my breath, straining my ears. Stopped after a while, and I told myself it was a deer. But I didn't sleep much after that. The fourth day, I found something strange. Behind the cabin, near the tree line, I noticed prints in the mud. Not animal prints, but shoe prints. They were faint, softened by rain, but clear enough to see the tread. Someone had walked there not long ago. I followed them a short distance until they disappeared into the thicker woods. I felt my stomach tighten. No one should be out there. I hadn't seen a single hiker or fisherman since arriving. The cabin was far enough off the main road that no one stumbled onto it by accident. I spent most of that day inside, my nerves sharper now. Every sound outside made me pause. I checked the latch on the door more than once, and even blocked the back window with a chair. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the thought of someone else out there, watching the cabin. That night was the worst so far. I heard movement again after dark. Not just once or twice, but steady, deliberate steps circling the cabin. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping. At one point, something brushed against the wall near the back window. I sat in the dark with the lantern out, holding the small hatchet I had used for chopping wood. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I wanted to yell, to scare whoever it was away, but my throat stayed locked. I waited, barely breathing, until finally the sounds faded off into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I checked around the cabin. More shoe prints, clearer this time. They circled the cabin, stopped at the window, at the porch, at the back door. Someone had walked slowly all around while I sat inside. I felt sick. I decided then I couldn't stay. I packed some of my things, loaded them into the car, and planned to leave that afternoon. But when I turned the key, the engine clicked weakly and wouldn't start. I tried again and again, but it was dead. I checked under the hood but saw nothing obvious. I thought about the possibility that someone had tampered with it. That thought rooted itself in my mind, and it made the air around me feel even heavier. With no way to leave, I was stuck. I thought about walking out, but 6 miles of narrow road through thick woods felt unsafe with someone lurking nearby. I kept the hatchet close and stayed inside most of the day. I barely ate, my stomach tight from fear. Every little creak made me freeze. That night, I heard the steps again, but closer, slower. Then a thump against the wall. Then another, like someone testing the cabin, pushing lightly against it. I sat on the floor near the stove, hatchet in hand, staring at the door. Hours passed like that. My legs were numb, my back stiff, but I couldn't move. At some point in the night, I heard the latch on the door shift, just slightly, but enough to know someone had touched it. I gripped the hatchet tighter and waited. The latch held. Whoever it was didn't force it, but I stayed frozen until daylight seeped in through the cracks. When morning came, I checked the porch. The latch had faint scratches around it, fresh marks that hadn't been there before. My chest felt hollow. Someone had tried to get in. I spent that day preparing in case they came back. I dragged furniture in front of the door. I kept the hatchet by my side. I didn't light the lantern at night, sitting in darkness to stay hidden. The 6th night was the breaking point. Started the same, footsteps outside, slow, deliberate. Then silence. Then a knock. Just 3 dull knocks on the door. My whole body locked. I sat there in the dark, barely able to breathe, the hatchet slick in my hand from sweat. Another knock came, harder. Then silence again. I waited, every muscle tense. Then I heard the window behind me creak. The sound of wood shifting, glass faintly tapping. I turned, and in the dim light from outside, I saw the outline of a hand pressing against the glass. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the hatchet. The hand lingered for a moment, then slid away. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking, staring at the window. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The forest outside went quiet again. But I didn't sleep. I stayed awake until the gray light of morning. That day, I forced myself to walk to the car again. I turned the key, and this time, after sputtering, it caught. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I didn't waste a second. I threw the rest of my things into the back, left the cabin as it was, and drove down the gravel road as fast as the car would go without sliding. My eyes stayed on the rearview mirror the whole way, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove until I reached town, until I saw people, lights, noise. Only then did I finally let myself breathe. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend something vague about car trouble and bad weather. I didn't explain what really happened. I didn't want to. All I know is someone was out there, circling that cabin night after night, watching, testing the walls and doors. They never broke in, never showed themselves fully, but they were there. And I will never forget the sight of that hand against the glass, in the middle of the dark, in the middle of nowhere. I remember the day I decided to go alone to the cabin. It was the kind of decision that seemed harmless at first, the sort that almost anyone could make without thinking too much about it. The cabin itself was far from the nearest town, nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by dense pine trees that stretched higher than any house I had ever seen. I had visited it once as a child with my family, but it had been years since anyone had been there, and now it felt almost abandoned, though the structure itself was solid and still maintained. My intention was simple. I wanted a break from everything. Work, the city, the constant hum of people, noise and traffic. Just me, some books, basic food, and the quiet forest. That quiet alone felt like a luxury I hadn't experienced in years. I arrived mid-afternoon, the sun high enough to cast shadows that moved slowly across the forest floor. The road was rough, dirt and gravel, twisting in a way that made the drive slower than I expected. As I approached the cabin, I could see the remnants of old maintenance. The roof was intact, the windows were boarded carefully, and the front door was heavy but functional. I parked the car at a small clearing near the front, grabbed my backpack, and walked up the slight slope to the porch. I paused for a moment to take in the smell. The air was thick with pine and the dampness of recent rain. A smell both fresh and heavy. A smell that made me feel like I was entering a place untouched by the city's concrete and exhaust fumes. The cabin inside was dusty but livable. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and a layer of dirt covered most surfaces. There was a small kitchen area with a gas stove that looked like it still worked, and a fridge that I hoped had electricity, though I had brought a cooler with ice just in case. The living area had a fireplace, the logs still neatly stacked, and a few chairs that seemed older than me. Upstairs was a small loft with a single bed, a mattress thin but usable, and a window that overlooked the forest. I set my backpack down, unpacked some essentials, and opened the windows. The forest pressed against the cabin on all sides, the trees so close that the light dimmed earlier than usual inside the structure. The first night I slept poorly, not because I was scared, at least not consciously, but because the unfamiliar sounds of the forest kept me awake. The wind moved through the branches with a groan that sounded almost like the distant movement of heavy machinery. I heard birds I couldn't identify, and somewhere in the distance, the dull, heavy thump of what I later realized was a deer walking through the underbrush. Each sound made me hyper-aware of my solitude. I tried reading to distract myself, but every snap of a twig or rustle in the leaves outside the window drew my attention back to the forest. By the second day, I had settled into a routine. I chopped wood for the fireplace, cleaned a little, and started preparing basic meals. I made coffee and sat on the porch watching the sun filter through the trees, noting the way the shadows stretched across the clearing. It was peaceful in a way that was both comforting and unnerving. The quiet gave me space to think, but it also reminded me how vulnerable I was out here, alone and isolated. It was on the third day that I started to notice things that made me uneasy, small details at first easy to dismiss. My firewood seemed slightly disturbed. Logs moved from where I had left them. I chalked it up to the wind or perhaps an animal brushing against the pile, but I started checking the perimeter more carefully. The forest seemed almost too quiet at times. Birds would stop singing for hours, and even the small rodents that usually scurried around the edges of the clearing seemed absent. It wasn't night yet, but the sense of stillness was heavy, like holding your breath for too long. I tried not to let it get to me, but that night, I heard something unusual. At first, I thought it was the wind again, or maybe the cabin settling. But the sound was different. A slow, deliberate dragging, like heavy boots over fallen branches. My heart raced and I froze, listening. The sound moved around the perimeter of the cabin, slow and careful, and then stopped. I told myself it was probably a hiker or someone passing through, but the nearest trail was miles away, and it was unlikely anyone would be out here at night. I double-checked the locks, bolted the door, and sat by the fireplace with a knife close at hand. Sleep was nearly impossible. The next day, I went further into the forest to clear my mind. I followed a small creek, careful to mark my path, though I knew the terrain was familiar from old maps. The further I went, the more I felt the isolation pressing against me. At one point, I heard another sound, distant but deliberate. Footsteps moving through underbrush, slower than any deer, heavier than any animal I had seen. I froze and waited, but whatever it was stayed out of sight. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a primal alert that I couldn't ignore. I didn't see anyone, and when I returned to the cabin, nothing seemed disturbed further than the minor shifts in firewood. Over the next couple of days, I noticed subtle signs that someone or something had been near the cabin. Footprints in the mud outside, strange scratches along the base of the door, a small branch broken in the yard that I hadn't seen before. Each time I found something, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. I considered leaving, but at the same time, I was determined not to give in to fear. I told myself the forest was full of animals and that the evidence could easily be explained by nature. But deep down, I knew something about the way these disturbances occurred didn't feel natural. They were precise, too deliberate to be random animal activity. One evening, I was sitting in the loft reading when I noticed movement outside the window. A shadow flitted through the clearing, just at the edge of the light from the porch. I froze, heart pounding. I watched carefully as the shadow seemed to linger, then vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. I didn't see anyone, but I knew someone had been there. My first thought was to call for help, but my phone had no signal, and the nearest town was over an hour away by dirt road. The reality of the isolation hit me all at once. I was alone, truly alone, and there was no immediate way to get assistance. I spent the rest of the night in near constant vigilance, checking locks, windows, and doors repeatedly. I slept in the clothes I had worn that day, keeping my shoes by the bed and a flashlight in hand. Every sound outside made my pulse spike. The wind, branches, the distant call of animals, but also the sounds that didn't make sense. Faint rustling, something moving just out of sight, too slow and deliberate for any normal forest creature. The following day, I devised a plan to secure the cabin better. I reinforced the doors and windows with whatever I could find. Chairs, boards, and even the heavy logs from the fireplace. I felt ridiculous, but the unease wouldn't go away. That afternoon, I went for another walk, this time taking a long stick with me, prepared to defend myself if necessary. I walked the perimeter, trying to spot anything unusual. Near the edge of the clearing, I found something chilling. Footprints, fresh, leading into the forest and then disappearing. They weren't animal prints. I knew that immediately. I spent the next 2 days in a heightened state of alert. I barely left the cabin, cooking only when necessary, keeping the fire going constantly to provide light and warmth. I made sure every window was covered, every possible entry point reinforced. Sleep was minimal. My mind constantly imagined the figure that had left those prints, imagining scenarios in which I had to confront them. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified. Every shadow seemed like someone watching. On the 6th night, the tension reached a peak. I was awake near the fireplace when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate, slow. I gripped the knife, my body rigid with fear. I waited, straining to hear, but the sound stopped. A long silence followed, suffocating in its intensity. I stayed awake for hours, too tense to move. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I dozed fitfully, waking repeatedly at the slightest noise. The next morning, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night. I packed as quickly as possible, taking only essentials and loaded my car. Before leaving, I walked the perimeter one last time. There were no new footprints, but the ones I had seen before seemed more numerous than I remembered, almost as if someone had been watching me for days. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine, feeling the tension slowly drain away as I drove toward the road. By the time I reached the nearest town, relief had settled over me, but the memory of those days stayed with me. I realized later that the fear I had felt wasn't just from isolation. It was from the knowledge that someone else had been close, observing, and potentially planning. The experience changed the way I thought about being alone in the wilderness. I still love the forest and the quiet, but I no longer underestimate how vulnerable a person can be when truly isolated. The cabin itself was no longer a safe retreat. It was a reminder of how careful one must be, even in what seems like a serene, empty place. I drove up into the mountains with the plan of staying alone in an old cabin I had rented for a week. The cabin was small, sitting deep in the woods, about a half-mile from the gravel road where I parked my truck. The owner had told me it was simple, just a single room with a stove, a bed, and a small bathroom with running water from a tank. I wanted peace, time away from noise and people, but I did not think too hard about how isolated it would feel once I was actually there. The trail that led to the cabin was narrow and covered with fallen leaves. I had to carry my gear in 2 trips. The cabin sat in a clearing, rough logs stacked tightly together with a tin roof. There was a small porch with 2 old wooden chairs. The windows were small and square, each with simple curtains. I noticed right away how quiet it was. No traffic, no voices, not even distant farm noises. Just trees, the sound of wind pushing through them, and sometimes the sharp cry of a bird. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wood and dust. The bed had a thin mattress. There was a wood stove in the corner with a pile of cut logs stacked against the wall. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, powered by a small generator outside that I would need to turn on when it grew dark. There was no phone signal at all. The owner had said if I needed help, I would have to hike back down to the road. That fact did not bother me at first. It even felt exciting to be so cut off. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my food and gear, checked the small bathroom, and got used to the space. I walked around the clearing, taking in how thick the forest was. The trees pressed close, tall pines mixed with bare oaks. The ground was covered in needles, leaves, and damp earth. The air felt colder in the shadows. That night, I cooked a simple meal on the stove, then sat outside until the sun dropped and the clearing fell into darkness. The stars came out clear and sharp above me. When I finally went inside and shut the door, I felt calm. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I read books I had brought and listened to the creaks of the cabin as it adjusted to the cold. The generator hummed outside for a few hours until I shut it down before sleeping. The nights were darker than I had ever experienced, with no glow of distant cities or houses. My flashlight beam seemed to cut into an endless wall of black. I lay awake sometimes listening, but all I heard was the forest. By the 3rd night, I started noticing little things. A scrape against the side of the cabin, faint but enough to wake me. I told myself it was branches moving in the wind. Later, I heard a dull thud, like something heavy had been dropped outside. I stayed still in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound. None came, so I convinced myself it was nothing unusual and eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I checked outside. There were no branches near the wall, no sign of anything heavy that could have made the noise. The dirt near the porch looked disturbed, like something had stepped around there, but the ground was too hard to leave clear tracks. I stood for a while staring at the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something watching, but nothing moved. The forest looked the same as always. That day, I tried to shake it off. I spent time walking through the woods, though I kept close enough that I would not lose the cabin. The forest felt larger the more I moved through it, as if the trees kept swallowing space. It was easy to imagine getting turned around. I returned early and stacked more firewood by the stove. I kept myself busy, but when evening came and the light dimmed, I felt unsettled. That night, the noises grew louder. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of crunching leaves outside, slow and steady, like footsteps. They circled partway around the cabin and then stopped. My heart beat so hard I felt it in my throat. I stayed still in bed, straining to hear more. After a long silence, the steps started again, fading toward the woods. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the steps had seemed too steady, too heavy. In the morning, I searched again. This time I saw marks near the porch steps, pressed into the dirt, not clear enough to call footprints, but not random either. They seemed placed like someone had walked back and forth. The more I looked at them, the colder I felt. That day dragged by. Every noise in the forest put me on edge. I ate little, too tense to feel hungry. I kept thinking about hiking back to my truck, but part of me didn't want to admit I was spooked. I told myself it was just animals, that staying calm was best. But when the sun began to set, dread settled into me. I shut the door earlier than usual, locked it, and sat near the stove with my flashlight close. The night that followed was the worst so far. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a scraping sound right at the wall near my head. Long, slow drags, like something being pulled across the logs. Then came a knock, soft but deliberate, 3 times. I froze. My skin prickled all over. I could not move, barely breathed. The knock did not come again, but soon after, I heard the crunch of steps circling the cabin. They stopped near the back where I had stacked wood. For nearly an hour, I sat up in bed, clutching the flashlight, staring at the dark window. Eventually, exhaustion forced me into a shallow sleep. At dawn, I checked outside. The stack of firewood had been disturbed. Several logs were scattered on the ground, as if someone had thrown them. I knew animals could move things, but not like that. These had been tossed several feet. I stood there for a long time with the morning light creeping across the clearing, my nerves fraying. By then, my plan had changed. I decided to cut my trip short. I would stay one more night, only because I did not want to haul everything down the trail in darkness, but in the morning I would pack and leave. That decision gave me some comfort during the day, though unease lingered. I forced myself to eat a proper meal and tried to keep my thoughts steady. When the last night came, I locked the door as usual and kept the flashlight in my lap. I left the generator running longer than normal, letting the steady hum mask the silence outside. Around midnight, I shut it off, the cabin sinking back into heavy darkness. I stayed awake, determined not to be caught off guard. The noises came later than before. First faint cracks of branches, then the crunch of steps, slow and deliberate. This time they did not circle. They came straight toward the porch. I sat frozen, holding the flashlight, my ears straining. The steps reached the door. I heard the faint creak of the wooden boards on the porch, then the rattle of the doorknob. Someone was trying it, slow and steady, testing the lock. Every muscle in my body locked tight. I stared at the door, barely breathing, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The knob rattled again, harder this time, followed by a low scrape against the door, like something being dragged across it. I felt sure it was a hand. Minutes dragged on, then silence. I did not hear the steps retreat. I sat there, shaking, my mind racing. I pictured someone standing just outside, waiting. I could not bring myself to move or look through the window. Hours passed in that state, my nerves stretched to breaking. When light finally seeped through the curtains, I moved for the first time. I opened the door carefully, my stomach tight. The dirt near the porch was disturbed again, more clearly this time. There were prints, not sharp but unmistakable. Human prints. Someone had been there, circling, testing the door, standing outside in the dark. I did not waste time. I shoved my gear into my pack, barely caring how it fit. I loaded everything onto my shoulders and left the cabin without looking back. The trail felt longer than before, every step heavy with fear. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following. When I reached my truck, relief washed over me. I threw my gear into the back and started the engine as fast as I could. The road away from the forest felt endless, but each mile put more distance between me and the cabin. By the time I reached town, my hands still shook on the wheel. I knew without doubt that someone had been out there each night, watching, circling, testing. I never learned who it was or why. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I drove up into the mountains on a Friday afternoon, trying to get away from the noise of everything. I wanted peace, space to think, and a break from the endless screens and people I was surrounded by every single day. I had rented a small cabin for 3 nights, tucked away deep in the woods, about an hour from the nearest small town. The place was old but decent, built mostly from pine, with a slanted roof and a wide porch. It had no neighbors nearby, just endless trees and a narrow dirt road leading up to it. When I pulled in, the sun was dipping low through the treetops, making the woods look stretched out and orange. The air felt heavy and cool, and I remember thinking how quiet it was, almost too quiet. The cabin sat in a clearing with a gravel patch for parking. Around it were thick clusters of tall trees, most of them pine and fir, some so close together they looked like walls. There was no real yard, just wild grass, dead branches, and roots pushing through the dirt. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly like old wood, mixed with something damp. The living space was simple. 1 couch, a coffee table, a small wood stove, and a kitchen with old counters and cupboards that had been painted white years ago and had since chipped into patches. A staircase led to a loft where the bed was. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. That was part of why I came. I wanted the stillness. I wanted to sit on the porch at night, maybe read, maybe write, maybe just breathe. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a small meal, listened to the fire crackle in the stove, and then walked outside before bed. The sky was full of stars, darker than I had ever seen near home, but the forest seemed to swallow sound. I couldn't hear crickets, couldn't hear the breeze, couldn't hear much of anything except the occasional snapping of wood far off. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the darkness in between the trees. Something about the stillness made me uneasy, though I told myself it was only because I wasn't used to it. I locked the door that night, pulled the curtains, and tried to sleep. Every time I shifted, the cabin made little settling noises, creaks and groans that echoed in the silence. It wasn't frightening, just strange, like being in a place that hadn't seen people in a long time. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee, and sat on the porch. It was colder than I expected, and fog sat low across the trees. I watched the fog slowly thin out while I drank, the woods reappearing in pieces. The quiet stretched on. After finishing, I decided to take a short walk down the dirt road to stretch my legs. The road wound down the slope for about a mile, twisting between tall trees before disappearing into more woods. There were no cabins, no side paths, nothing, just forest. As I walked, I noticed how soft the ground was with pine needles, how sound got swallowed quickly when I tried to listen to my own footsteps. I stopped once, trying to take it all in, and felt like I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. When I got back to the cabin, the porch light, an old bulb in a rusty fixture, was on. I hadn't turned it on. I remembered that clearly, because the first night I had checked the switches and saw it worked but decided to leave it off. I walked closer, staring at the faint yellow glow, trying to come up with a reason. Maybe it had a timer. Maybe the wiring was faulty. Still, it bothered me. I flipped the switch off once inside and sat for a long time staring at the door, wondering why it unsettled me so much. By afternoon, I tried to ignore it. I cooked again, then sat outside with a book. Around evening, I heard something from the trees, faint but sharp, a stick breaking, then another. It wasn't like the random noises from the first night. This sounded closer, deliberate. I stared into the woods, trying to see movement, but all I saw were rows of trees and shadows stretching long as the sun went down. Later that night, when I locked up and climbed into bed in the loft, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I lay in the dark, listening. Hours passed. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound. It wasn't the cabin creaking. It was outside, soft, steady footsteps on gravel. My heart began pounding. The parking area was small, just a patch right outside. Whoever was out there was only feet from the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loud. The steps stopped, then crunched again, slow, circling the side of the cabin. The wooden boards of the porch groaned lightly a moment later. Someone was on it. I thought of the front door, thin and old, with just a small lock. I thought of how alone I was. No signal, no neighbors, nobody to hear me if something happened. The boards creaked again, heavier, like weight shifting. Then silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling, gripping the blanket, too scared to move. After what felt like forever, I finally heard the faint crunch of gravel again, moving away. My body stayed frozen until the sound disappeared entirely. When morning came, I stepped outside, every part of me uneasy. The ground was damp from dew, and sure enough, there were footprints in the gravel. Clear shoe prints, not mine. They went around the cabin, across the porch, and then back toward the road. My stomach sank. Someone had been there. For the rest of that day, I couldn't relax. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I kept telling myself maybe it was just someone hiking, maybe someone lost. But I knew better. Lost hikers don't circle cabins at 2 in the morning. That night, I barely slept. I left the stove fire burning low, sat on the couch, and listened. Around midnight, it happened again. The crunch of gravel. Slow, steady, deliberate. My chest tightened. The footsteps came closer. I pictured someone standing outside staring at the walls, listening. This time, I got up as quietly as I could and looked out a small side window, pulling the curtain just an inch. First, I saw nothing but trees. Then I saw him, a man standing near the porch, facing the cabin. He wasn't moving, just standing there. He wore dark clothes, his face hidden by shadows. My breath caught. I let the curtain fall shut, my heart slamming in my chest. He didn't knock. He didn't try the door. He just stayed for what felt like forever. I sat on the couch, gripping a heavy fireplace tool, waiting. Finally, the boards creaked. The steps moved away again, down the gravel, fading into the woods. By morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay. I packed everything quickly, shoved it into the car, and got ready to leave. When I went around to the driver's side, I froze. On the windshield was a smear of dirt, drawn by a finger. It was a line with an X through it. Nothing else. No note. Just that. My throat tightened as I stared at it. I drove down the dirt road faster than I should have, glancing in the mirror again and again. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, where the forest opened slightly and I could see more of the sky. Even then, I didn't feel safe. That night, back at my own home, I kept thinking about the man. How he moved slow, how he stood staring, how he left that mark on the glass. I kept thinking about how deep those woods were, how easy it would be for someone to hide out there, watching cabins, waiting. And I thought about how nobody would have known if I hadn't left. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked for a refund. I couldn't bring myself to call the rental owner, couldn't explain what happened in words that made sense. To this day, when I think of silence, when I think of still woods, I hear those footsteps again, slow and patient on the gravel, and I know I wasn't supposed to be there. I remember the first time I laid eyes on the cabin. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just an old wooden place tucked between tall pines and spruces, a little off a dirt road that seemed to disappear into nowhere. I had rented it for a week, thinking it would be quiet and private, a good chance to be away from everything. I had been tired from work, tired of people, and I thought being alone in the woods would help me clear my mind. The cabin sat on a slope. From the small gravel clearing where I parked my car, I had to walk down a short dirt path with loose stones. The place looked worn down but solid. The wood had darkened with age, the roof had some moss growing on it, and the steps creaked when I walked up. There was a small porch with 2 chairs, both covered in dust and pollen. I pushed the door open and stepped into the stale air inside. The inside was simple, a living area with a sagging couch, a table, and a couple of shelves with old books and random tools. There was a fireplace with some stacked wood beside it. The kitchen was tiny with just a counter, a sink, a propane stove, and a rusted fridge that worked on gas. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress and an old quilt folded at the end. The bathroom was more like an afterthought, with a weak showerhead and a toilet that looked like it belonged in a campground. First, everything seemed fine. I unpacked some things, checked the cupboards, and made sure I had enough bottled water and canned food. The sun was setting by the time I finished, and I remember looking out the window. The woods seemed to close in once the light started to fade. The trees stood tall and close together, and the shadows grew deep between them. That first night was quiet, too quiet. When I lay in bed, I noticed how different the silence was compared to the city. It wasn't just the absence of traffic or people. It was heavy silence, broken only by the occasional crack of branches or rustling leaves. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat. Every sound seemed sharper, louder. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a noise outside. First, I thought it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard something that didn't sound right. It wasn't a quick rustle or a short movement. It was slow, steady, like someone was walking. My heart started to race. I stayed still in the bed, straining my ears. The steps seemed to circle around the cabin, moving from one side to the other. I held my breath, waiting. After a while, it stopped, and the silence returned. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around outside. I didn't see anything right away, but near the back of the cabin, the dirt looked disturbed. It wasn't a clear footprint, but more like the ground had been pressed down. I told myself it was probably an animal. The woods were full of them, but the thought of someone walking around while I slept wouldn't leave my head. During the day, I tried to distract myself. I went for a short hike on a trail I had seen nearby. The forest was thick, and the further I walked, the more I felt closed in. I kept hearing small noises behind me, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. I tried not to look back too often, but it made me uneasy. When I finally turned around to head back, I thought I saw something between the trees. A shape, maybe just a trick of the light. Still, I walked faster on the way back to the cabin. That night, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and kept the light on for a while. I told myself I was being paranoid. But again, in the middle of the night, I woke up to noises. This time it was softer, but closer. I thought I heard the steps on the porch. I sat up in bed, my ears straining. The wood creaked. I froze, staring at the dark shape of the door from the bedroom. The sound went on for a while, then stopped. I waited, listening, my body tense, until exhaustion finally pulled me back under. In the morning, I saw clear marks on the porch. Dirt smeared on the wood like from a boot or shoe. Not an animal. My stomach sank. Someone had been there. I thought about leaving that day, but I had told myself I wouldn't waste the money or the chance to be alone. I tried to convince myself it was probably just some local messing around, maybe hunters or kids. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I stayed near the cabin most of the day, chopping some firewood and trying to keep busy. That evening, I noticed something strange. On the edge of the clearing between the trees, I saw something hanging. When I walked closer, I saw it was a piece of rope tied between 2 branches. From it hung what looked like a piece of cloth, old, torn, and dirty. My chest tightened. I couldn't think of any reason why it would be there. I left it and went back inside, locking the door again. That night was the worst. I woke to noises again, but this time they were louder, bolder. Someone was definitely on the porch. I could hear the boards creaking as weight shifted on them. Then came a slow, dragging sound along the wall, like something heavy brushing against it. My heart pounded in my throat. I sat in the dark, gripping the handle of a kitchen knife I had brought into the bedroom earlier. The sound went on and off for what felt like hours. Then silence. At dawn, I opened the door just a crack. There were smears of dirt and what looked like marks on the wood of the door, near the handle. Someone had tried to turn it. My whole body shook as I stared at it. I made up my mind to leave, but when I walked to my car, I froze. One of the tires was flat, not just low on air, slashed. The cut was clean, straight through. My chest went cold. This wasn't random. Someone wanted me stuck there. I felt panic rise, but I forced myself to think. I still had 3 other tires. I could drive slowly, maybe make it back to town. I got in the car and turned the key. The engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. When I checked under the hood, I saw the wires had been cut. My only way out was ruined. I spent the day pacing inside the cabin, checking the windows, trying to think of what to do. There was no phone signal, no landline. I was trapped. Every sound from the woods made me jump. I kept the knife with me at all times. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair facing the door, the knife on my lap, the fire dying down to embers. Hours passed in silence. Then I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin, then stopped by the window. I didn't move, but I felt the presence there, just beyond the thin wall. Then came the faintest tap on the glass. My blood ran cold. I stayed awake until the light of morning. When I finally got the courage to look outside, I saw smudges on the glass, like someone had pressed their fingers against it. By then, I knew I couldn't last a week. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. They were watching me, waiting. I gathered the few things I had, packed some food, water, and the knife, and decided to leave on foot. I didn't care how far the nearest road or town was. Staying in the cabin felt like waiting to die. I stepped into the woods, moving quickly at first, then slower as the forest grew thick. I kept looking back, certain I was being followed. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my throat dry. The forest seemed endless. Every path looked the same. I wasn't sure if I was even going the right way. Then I saw it, a piece of cloth tied to a branch, the same as the one near the cabin. My stomach dropped. I realized I was being led in circles. Whoever was watching me had marked the forest. They knew where I was going before I did. By evening, exhausted and terrified, I stumbled back into the clearing where the cabin stood. My chest felt hollow. I had walked all day only to return to the same place. I knew then that I was being played with. That night, I barricaded the door with furniture and sat in the dark, clutching the knife. Hours passed. Then came the sound again. But this time it didn't stop at the walls or the porch. This time the door shook. Not just once, but hard over and over. The furniture rattled. I pressed my weight against it, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The shaking went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. By morning, I was barely holding myself together. I hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. I knew I couldn't last. I had 2 choices: stay and wait or try the woods again. I chose the woods. I packed what was left, slung my bag over my shoulder, and forced myself to keep walking in one direction, no matter what. I ignored the cloth markers, ignored the feeling of eyes on me, ignored the fear clawing at my chest. I walked until my legs felt like they would give out. At last, late in the day, I heard something. Not footsteps, not branches. A sound of an engine, faint but real. My heart leapt. I pushed through the trees until I stumbled onto a dirt road. And there, in the distance, was a truck moving slowly. I ran into the road, waving my arms until the driver stopped. I didn't care what I looked like, wild-eyed, dirty, clutching a knife. I was just grateful. I never thought much about being alone in the woods until I actually put myself in that position. I had rented a cabin far out in the forest, a place that was meant to give me quiet, distance, and a break from noise. I had been working long weeks and wanted nothing but silence. The pictures of the cabin looked simple but comfortable. It was small, made of old wood with a metal roof, a porch that faced a lake, and tall pine trees surrounding it from all sides. There was no one else around for miles, and that was what attracted me most at first. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, just dirt and rocks, and my car shook hard as I drove down it. When I reached the clearing, the cabin sat in the middle of tall grass and thick woods. It looked older than it had in the pictures, more weathered, with wood that had dark stains from years of rain. The roof looked rusty in spots, and the porch boards bent under my feet when I walked on them. But it was still standing, and the door opened with a stiff push. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small table, a couple of chairs, a couch that had stuffing poking through, and a wood stove. There was a little kitchen area with a sink that ran off a pump, no electricity, and a small bedroom with a thin mattress on an old bed frame. There was a back door that led to the woods and a front door that looked out at the lake. I had brought supplies with me: canned food, water jugs, a lantern, and a small battery-powered radio. I was ready to spend a week there, maybe more. The first day felt calm. I unloaded my things, set up the lantern on the table, stacked my food on the counter, and walked down to the lake. The water was still, with trees reflecting on the surface. There were no other houses, no people, no sound of cars, nothing but the wind moving through the trees. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the air, thinking that this was exactly what I had wanted. That night, I built a fire in the stove and sat on the couch while the cabin filled with warmth. I ate canned soup and crackers, then stretched out on the bed. The mattress was rough, but I was tired. As I lay there, I noticed how dark it was. The cabin had no lights except my lantern, which I had turned off, and outside the windows, there was nothing but black. The forest swallowed everything. I had never felt darkness that deep before. It wasn't like being in the city where streetlights glowed. This was thick, heavy black that seemed endless. I listened to the forest sounds, small snaps of twigs, the cry of a distant bird, the occasional rustle of leaves. It was natural, but it still made me alert. The second day passed quietly too. I chopped some wood for the stove, explored a little path behind the cabin, and sat out on the porch with a book. The weather was cool, and the air smelled of pine. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. When night came again, I sat listening to the radio, catching a weak signal that brought faint music. I dozed off in the chair, woke up to darkness, and went to bed. It was the third night when things began to feel different. I had gone to sleep after eating, the fire in the stove still giving a dull glow. At some point, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but I lay there listening. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. Then I heard it, slow steps outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal. I had grown up in the countryside and knew the difference. Animals moved in quick, uneven bursts. These were steady steps, pressing down on the grass, one after another, circling slowly around the cabin. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. I didn't move or breathe too loud. The steps moved from the front, past the porch, around the side, and then faded. I stayed awake for hours after, waiting, but they didn't return. The next morning, I walked outside, trying to tell myself it was my imagination. The grass around the cabin was tall in most places, but near the porch, I saw patches that were pressed down. They looked like spots where someone had walked through, flattening the grass. I told myself it could have been a deer or something, but it didn't look random. It looked like a trail. That day, I couldn't focus. I sat with my book but kept looking at the windows. I walked down to the lake but didn't enjoy it. I felt watched. By evening, the unease only grew stronger. I checked that the doors were locked, even though the locks were just simple latches. I kept the lantern burning longer, then forced myself to turn it off to save fuel. When I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The fire in the stove had burned down, and the room was cold. I pulled the blanket tight around me, staring at the ceiling. After some time, I heard it again, the steps. This time, slower. They came from the trees and circled close to the walls. I heard one step on the porch, the board creaking under the weight. I held my breath, terrified the door would push open, but after a long time, the sound faded back into the woods. In the morning, I went outside again. The porch board was bent down, fresh. I knelt to look and saw mud smeared where a foot had pressed. It was a shoe print, not an animal. My stomach sank. Someone had been there, standing right outside the cabin while I was inside, helpless. I thought about leaving that day, but the road was rough, and I wasn't sure if I could make it out quickly. I told myself maybe it was some hunter passing through, maybe just someone wandering, but deep down I knew it wasn't that. No hunter creeps around cabins at night without saying anything. That day, I kept busy, stacking wood and cleaning, anything to move my hands and stop thinking. I kept checking the trees, scanning for movement. By the time night came again, I felt worn out. I put the fire higher in the stove, kept my lantern close, and even sat with my pocket knife in my hand. The steps came again. This time, they stopped at the back door. The handle rattled softly. I gripped the knife, sweating, waiting for it to turn, but it didn't. After a long silence, the sound drifted away again. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed my bag quickly, stuffing food and clothes inside. When I stepped outside, the cool air hit me. I walked to my car, but when I got there, my stomach twisted. The tires were flat, all 4 of them. I stood there staring, my hands shaking. Someone had slashed them. It wasn't an accident. Whoever had been walking around the cabin had done this to trap me. My only way out was gone. I went back inside, bolting the doors. My mind raced. I had no phone signal out here, no neighbors, no road to walk easily without being exposed. I thought about staying hidden inside until the end of my rental week, but fear ate at me. Whoever was out there had already taken steps to cut me off. They were planning something. That night was the worst. I sat with the lantern on low, holding the knife. The steps came again, this time louder, bolder. They circled the cabin slowly for hours. Every once in a while, they stopped at a window. I could almost feel eyes peering in, though I couldn't see through the dark glass. At one point, something brushed against the wall, a hand dragging along the wood. I stayed frozen until morning light began to creep through the cracks. When I finally stood up, my legs were stiff. I knew I couldn't last another night like that. I thought about the lake. If I followed the shoreline, maybe I could reach a main road. It would be long, but better than waiting. I packed a backpack with food, water, and the knife. I stuffed a flashlight inside too. I left the cabin, locking the door even though it didn't matter, and started toward the water. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I moved quickly but tried not to make too much noise. I stayed near the water, walking over rocks and roots, keeping my eyes on the trees. After maybe 2 hours, I saw something that froze me in place. In the dirt near the shoreline, there were more footprints. Fresh, the same shoe prints I had seen by the cabin. They were ahead of me, leading the same way I was going. Whoever had been at the cabin was also moving along the lake, maybe even knowing I would try to escape this way. I turned back quickly, heart racing. I didn't know what else to do. The cabin was dangerous, but the woods felt worse. If I ran into whoever it was, I wouldn't stand a chance. At least inside I had walls, a door, and some cover. When I reached the cabin again, I shoved the door shut and barred it with a chair. I sat shaking, trying to think. My food would last a while and I had water. Maybe I could last until the rental ended and someone came to check. But I didn't know how long that would be or if anyone would even come. That night, the steps came again. This time, they didn't circle. They stopped at the front porch. The boards creaked as weight pressed on them. Then came a heavy push on the door, the latch straining. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would break through my chest. After a long pause, the pressure stopped. The steps moved away. The following morning, I found a knife mark carved into the door, a single deep slash across the wood. I stood staring at it, my hands cold. They wanted me to know they could get in whenever they wanted. They were waiting, playing with me. Days blurred together after that. I hardly slept. I had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. I rented a small wooden cabin deep in the woods because I wanted peace and quiet, far away from everything. Work had drained me, and the noise of the city was eating away at my head. I imagined myself sitting by the fire at night, cooking simple meals, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The cabin looked old in the pictures, but solid enough. It had one bedroom, a little kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. There was also a porch outside with a view of the trees that seemed endless. When I drove up, the gravel road turned into dirt, and eventually I reached a clearing where the cabin stood alone. The trees around it were thick and dark, almost swallowing the place. There were no other houses nearby, No signs of neighbors, no stores, not even power lines in sight. That was the point. I wanted to be completely away. I parked my car beside the cabin and carried my bags inside. The place smelled of old wood and dust, but it wasn't bad. It was quiet, too quiet in a way, the kind of silence that feels like it has weight pressing against your ears. I set my bags in the bedroom, checked the kitchen, and opened a window to let some fresh air inside. The forest smell filled the place. Pine, dirt, damp moss. The first day was calm. I unpacked food I had brought, cooked some eggs and bread, and then walked around the cabin to get a feel for the area. The trees stood close together, and the forest floor was uneven, full of rocks and fallen branches. It didn't take long before I realized how easy it would be to get lost if I went too deep. Even standing just a short walk from the cabin, I turned around and almost lost sight of it through the trees. That gave me a little shiver, so I decided not to wander too far. When night came, I made a fire in the fireplace. The flames lit the cabin in a soft orange glow. I sat on the old couch, listening to the crackle of wood. There was no internet, no phone signal. My phone was only good for taking pictures or checking the time. I read a book I brought, then ate some canned soup before heading to bed. It was in the middle of that first night that I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what stirred me. The fire had died down, and the cabin was dark except for the faint light from the moon shining through the window. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it, the crunch of something outside, leaves and twigs snapping. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I knew. It wasn't quick or random like a deer running. It was slow, step by step. Someone walking. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps circled the cabin. I could hear them clearly on one side, then fading, then louder again on the other side. Whoever it was, they were walking around, steady and slow. I didn't move. I just stayed there in bed, my heart pounding. I had no gun, no weapon except for a kitchen knife. My car was parked just outside, but the keys were on the small table by the couch in the living room. I thought about getting up quietly, but the floorboards creaked even when I walked normally. Whoever was out there would hear me right away. The footsteps stopped near the porch, then nothing, just silence, the kind that makes you think your ears are broken. I lay there frozen for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. In the morning, sunlight came through the windows. Everything looked calm. I almost convinced myself I had dreamed it, that the footsteps were part of some half-sleep haze. But when I stepped outside, I saw prints in the dirt, clear shoe prints. They circled the cabin. That's when the real weight of it hit me. Someone had been there. Someone had walked around the cabin in the middle of the night while I was inside. The prints were big, larger than my own feet, and deep enough to show it wasn't a quick pass. They lingered, walking around slowly, like they were checking the place. I told myself it could have been a hiker, someone passing through. Maybe they were curious. But then I thought, what hiker wanders around a cabin at night without knocking, without saying anything? The rest of that day, I couldn't relax. I checked the locks on the doors and windows over and over. The cabin only had a basic lock, nothing strong. The windows had latches, but they were old and could be forced open with enough effort. I cooked some food but barely ate. Every sound outside made me jump. A branch falling, a bird flapping, even the wind moving through the trees made me tense up. That night, I tried to go to bed early. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, listening. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I almost let myself believe it was over. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The same slow crunch of steps. This time, they didn't circle all the way around. They stopped near the porch again. I stared at the ceiling, not daring to move. My breathing was shallow. The sound of wood creaking followed, like weight shifting on the porch boards. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside the door. I waited for a knock, or for the door handle to move. Nothing, just standing there. After a long time, the steps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up in bed until the first light of morning. When I stepped outside again, the prints were there, fresh in the dirt leading toward the trees. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and driving home, but part of me resisted. I had paid for the cabin, I had driven hours to get there, and I told myself maybe it was just some weirdo passing through who wouldn't come back. If I left now, I'd feel like I had given up too easily, so I stayed. But the feeling of being watched never left me. During the day, I tried to distract myself. I chopped some wood, went for short walks, cooked meals, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone in the trees. That third night was the worst. It started the same silence, then footsteps. But this time, I heard scratching at one of the windows. Light at first, then harder. Metal against glass like a knife point or a key dragged across. My stomach twisted. I sat up in bed, staring at the bedroom door, frozen. The scratching stopped. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Slowly at first, then harder. The lock held, but it shook with each turn. I grabbed the kitchen knife I had taken to bed with me and held it tight, my hands sweating. The rattle went on for almost a full minute before it stopped. Then silence again. I stayed awake until morning, shaking, the knife still in my hand. When the sun came up, I went outside and checked the windows. One of them had long scratches across the glass, thin but deep. Someone had tried to cut or mark it. That was it for me. I knew I couldn't stay another night. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. They weren't just curious. They wanted in. I packed my bags quickly and loaded the car. The whole time, I felt exposed, like eyes were on me from the trees. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw someone step out from the trees near the cabin, watching. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I never reported it. I didn't know who to call or what to say. Nobody had broken in, nothing was stolen. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone had been out there, circling that cabin every night, trying the windows, testing the doors. I'll never forget that sound. The slow, steady footsteps in the dark, moving around me while I lay trapped inside, waiting for the moment the lock might finally give way. And I'll never go back to a cabin in the woods again. I never liked being away from people for too long, but when I got the chance to stay in a small cabin at the edge of the forest for a week, I convinced myself that some quiet time alone would be good for me. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, and I was told it was used mostly during hunting season. It was small, with just one bedroom, a little kitchen, and a wood stove. No running water except for a hand pump outside, and no cell service once you got past the last stretch of gravel road. They said it was peaceful, private, the kind of place where you could clear your head. I didn't really need to clear my head, but I thought maybe the isolation would help me slow down from my routine. The drive up was long, and by the time I reached the dirt road that led into the forest, the sun was starting to set. The last light came through the trees in narrow beams, and the shadows stretched far across the road, bending with the branches above. I remember how uneasy I felt even then. It wasn't fear exactly, but something about the silence in those woods felt heavy, like everything had already gone to sleep except me. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow path, surrounded by trees so dense that once I stepped out of my car, I couldn't even see the sky above me clearly. Felt boxed in, cut off from the rest of the world. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and ash from the last fire that had been burned in the stove. The windows were small and covered with mesh screens, and the furniture was simple. Just a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a shelf stacked with canned food. I brought my own supplies, but I noticed the previous visitors had left things like beans, soup, and rice. The walls were thin, and when the wind picked up outside, I could hear it whistling through little cracks in the boards. The first night wasn't too bad. I unpacked, cooked some noodles, and sat by the wood stove as the fire warmed the room. The silence was strange. Back home, I always heard cars in the distance, or neighbors talking, or some kind of hum from the city. Here there was nothing but the occasional creak of the wood or the sound of branches rubbing against the roof. I went to bed early, but I woke up several times during the night because of small noises. Once it was a thump on the porch. Another time it was what sounded like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch, maybe some animal sniffing around. But even then, I found myself lying awake in the dark, listening hard, my heart beating faster than it should have. The second day, I tried to relax. I walked around the woods a little, staying close to the cabin so I wouldn't get lost. The forest floor was covered in dead leaves, soft and damp under my boots. I didn't see any trails, no signs of other people, just endless trees stretching in every direction. When I came back, I noticed how quiet it was again. Not just peaceful quiet, but a kind that felt unnatural, like even the birds didn't want to make a sound. I cooked some food, read a bit from the book I brought, and by evening I tried to convince myself I was getting used to the stillness. But that night I heard footsteps. At first I wasn't sure. I was sitting near the stove, the fire crackling, when I heard something outside in the leaves. It was slow, uneven, like someone was walking but dragging their feet slightly. I froze and held my breath, listening. The sound circled part of the cabin, moving from one side to the other, then stopping. I told myself again it could be an animal, a deer maybe, but the longer I sat there, the more it sounded like someone deliberately walking, pausing, then taking another step. My skin went cold, and I remember how I gripped the edge of the chair without even realizing it. I didn't go outside. I just sat there until the fire died down and the noises stopped. When I finally got into bed, every creak of the cabin made me jump. I barely slept, and when I did, I woke up sweating, my mind filled with shapes moving outside the window. By the third day, I was questioning whether I should stay. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe it was just nerves from being alone. Maybe my mind was exaggerating every sound. I kept busy, chopping wood from a small pile outside, carrying water from the pump, sweeping the cabin floor. But that night, the sounds came again, clearer than before. This time, it was footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The boards creaked as weight shifted across them. Then there was a pause, and I swore I heard breathing through the thin wall. I sat in my bed, not moving, my body tense, waiting for something to happen. The door never opened, nothing crashed, but the sound of that breathing stayed for what felt like forever. Then the steps moved away, fading back into the forest. I didn't sleep at all after that. I kept staring at the window, half expecting to see someone's face pressed against the glass. By the fourth day, my nerves were frayed. I considered packing up and leaving, but the idea of walking out to my car in broad daylight somehow felt just as dangerous. The woods seemed thicker, darker, even in the morning. I felt watched every time I stepped outside. I barely ate. My stomach was tight with fear, and my hands shook when I tried to light the stove. That night, things escalated. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of leaves again, closer than before. Then the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. The wood groaned, as if pressure was being applied. I sat in the corner, clutching the small hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. My throat was dry, my whole body rigid. The scraping moved slowly along the wall, stopping near the back window. I stared at the glass, waiting. Nothing appeared. Then the steps came again, circling, stopping at the porch. The boards creaked, the sound of weight shifting closer to the door. Then silence. Hours passed like that. The sound would come, then fade, then come again, as if whoever or whatever was out there was waiting for me to break first. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. My eyes burned, my ears strained at every tiny noise. The next morning, I walked outside carefully, looking around the clearing. I didn't see anyone, but near the porch steps, the leaves were disturbed. It looked like footprints, faint but clear enough that they didn't belong to an animal. Human, bare feet, the shape pressed into the dirt. That was when I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there, someone barefoot, circling the cabin at night. My fear turned into panic. I wanted to leave right then, but my car was parked a short walk away, down the narrow path through the trees. I couldn't bring myself to go, not when I felt sure whoever was out there might be watching. I stayed locked inside all day, pacing, sweating, jumping at every crack of a branch outside. That night was the worst. Started the same, footsteps, scraping, slow movement around the cabin. Then came the knocking. Not hard, not loud, but steady, at the door. A soft knock 3 times, then silence. Then again. My chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. I gripped the hatchet so tightly my hands hurt. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat in the dark corner of the room staring at the door. The knocking went on for what felt like an hour, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. Later, I heard the window screen being pressed, the faint squeak of the mesh moving against the frame. I stared at the glass, certain I'd see eyes peering in. But nothing came, just the sound, then silence again. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things as fast as I could, shoving food, clothes, everything into my bag. I waited for the light to get strong enough. Then I forced myself out the door, heart pounding, looking everywhere as I rushed toward the car. The forest was silent again, but I felt watched with every step. When I reached the car, I fumbled the keys, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped them. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the clearing, I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, standing among the trunks, watching. No clothes that I could see, just pale skin and long, unkept hair hanging down. Barefoot, still, unmoving. I didn't stop. I drove until I reached the main road, and I didn't breathe properly until miles had passed. I never went back, never told anyone the full truth of what I saw, but I still think about it. Whoever was out there, they weren't trying to break in right away. They were waiting, testing, seeing how long I'd last in that cabin, how much fear I could carry before I gave up. If I had stayed another night, maybe they would have tried the door handle, maybe the window, maybe worse. And the worst part is knowing that cabin still stands, and whoever walked barefoot around it at night is probably still out there, waiting for someone else to come and stay alone. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend in the mountains for months. Life back in the city had been nothing but noise, schedules, and constant rushing, and I felt like I was burning out without even realizing it. When a coworker mentioned that her uncle rented out an old cabin deep in the woods, miles away from town, I jumped at the chance. She warned me it was very secluded. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just dirt roads and trees all around. That was exactly what I wanted. I told myself this would be the reset I needed. The drive up there took nearly 5 hours. The first couple hours were on the highway, but once I turned onto the smaller roads, it felt like I had entered another world. The roads became narrow and winding, hugging the sides of steep hills, with tall trees casting long shadows over the pavement. My car felt small compared to the forest around me. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I was bouncing slowly over an uneven dirt road that seemed to go on forever. My GPS had already lost signal, but I had printed directions in case that happened. After what felt like forever on that road, I finally saw the cabin. It was old, but it had a kind of charm to it. Dark wooden logs stacked neatly, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs, a stone chimney, and a tin roof that looked like it had seen decades of storms. Behind it stretched more endless forest, dark and thick. In front of it, a clearing opened up just enough to let some light in, with tall grass and a few scattered tree stumps. My car was the only thing breaking the stillness. I carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and stone, mixed with faint smoke, like it still held onto the scent of the last fire in the fireplace. The inside was simple: a small kitchen with an old stove, a heavy wooden table, a couple shelves lined with mismatched plates and cups. The living room had a sagging couch, the fireplace, and some old lamps. The bedroom was even simpler, just a bed with a quilt and a dresser. The bathroom was small, with plumbing that groaned when I turned on the sink. There was electricity, but it felt unreliable, the kind of wiring where you didn't want to plug too many things in at once. I unpacked slowly, settling in, telling myself this was going to be good for me. I wanted the silence. I wanted to feel cut off. For the first few hours, I sat on the porch, just watching the woods. The sound of wind moving through the trees was stronger here than I had ever heard. No cars, no voices, no music from a neighbor's apartment. Just that low, constant rush, broken sometimes by the cry of a bird or the rustle of leaves. By the time the sun began to sink, I was already getting restless. The silence that had felt peaceful at first now pressed in on me. I lit a fire in the fireplace inside and cooked something simple from the groceries I had brought. The night came quickly. Out here, once the sun dropped, there were no streetlights or cars or glowing windows from nearby houses. It was just black. The cabin was a small bubble of light surrounded by endless dark. I thought I was ready for that, but it felt heavier than I expected. I kept glancing at the windows, where the glass just reflected the lamplight back at me, hiding whatever might be outside. I sat by the fire until late, listening to the wood crackle, and finally forced myself to bed. The first night was restless. Every sound outside felt sharper in the dark. Branches creaking, wind pressing against the walls, something small moving quickly through the brush. I woke up several times, heart pounding, staring into the dark cabin, reminding myself that animals lived here and it was normal to hear things. But my mind kept going to the fact that no one was close. If something happened, no one would hear. The second day was easier. I went for a long walk, following a rough path into the woods. The trees grew so thick in some places that barely any light came through. The ground was soft with layers of fallen leaves and pine needles, my footsteps sinking with a muffled crunch. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything but birds and the occasional snap of a branch. When I came back to the cabin, the air felt heavy with quiet again, but I tried to enjoy it. I read, wrote in a notebook, cooked, and tried to remind myself I had chosen this. That night, though, things shifted. I had just laid down when I heard it, a sound that didn't fit with the usual creaks and groans of the woods. It was faint at first, like something brushing lightly against the cabin wall. I froze in bed, holding my breath. It came again, longer this time, a dragging sound, as if something rough was sliding against the wood. I forced myself up, heart thudding, and stood by the window. All I could see was the black outline of trees. The porch light was off, and I didn't want to turn it on and make myself more visible. I stood there for what felt like forever, ears straining, but the sound stopped. I went back to bed, telling myself it was a branch moving in the wind, but the wind had been still. The next morning, I checked outside. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the ground. Near one side of the wall, I noticed the grass was bent down, as if something had moved through it. The wood of the cabin had faint marks on it, not deep, but noticeable, like something rough had scraped against it. I crouched and touched the wall, trying to convince myself it had always been there, but I knew it hadn't. The rest of that day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed closer to the cabin, not wandering as far as before. I kept checking the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. I told myself maybe it was just a deer or bear rubbing against the cabin, but it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. That night was worse. The sounds came back, louder, longer. I sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight I had brought. Scraping, dragging, then silence. I thought about yelling out, but the thought of my own voice breaking the silence felt wrong, almost dangerous. Instead, I just sat there listening, waiting. Hours passed before the sounds finally faded. The next morning, I walked the perimeter again. This time, the marks on the wood were clearer. Long, uneven lines, some higher up, almost reaching the window. My stomach dropped when I saw them. Whatever had been there wasn't just brushing by. It had been reaching. I decided then I wouldn't stay another night. I started packing, stuffing my bag quickly. But when I got into the car and turned the key, the engine gave a weak cough and died. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't start. The panic rose in me. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I sat in the car for a long time, gripping the wheel, trying to think. The dirt road stretched on for miles. I could walk, but the thought of leaving the cabin behind and being swallowed by the woods made my chest tighten. I told myself I'd wait until morning. It would be safer in daylight. That night, I barely breathed. The sounds didn't just scrape this time. They circled. I could hear movement around the cabin, slow, deliberate steps in the grass. My skin prickled as I sat by the fireplace, clutching the poker, every muscle in my body ready to jump. At one point, something tapped lightly on the window, just one soft tap. I stared at the glass, frozen, unable to move, until the sound drifted away again. When daylight came, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, shoved food into it, filled a bottle of water, and left the cabin. I locked the door out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't matter. I forced myself onto the dirt road, heart racing, looking over my shoulder every few steps. The woods felt too quiet, as if even the birds were holding back. I walked for hours. The road stretched endlessly, each turn looking the same as the last. Sweat soaked my shirt, my legs ached, and still there was no sign of another car, another house, anything. I kept telling myself, just keep moving, don't stop, don't look back. But eventually I did. I stopped and turned, and for just a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees. Figure low, moving quickly out of sight. My chest tightened, and I forced myself forward faster. It took nearly half a day before I finally reached a paved road. When I saw it, my legs almost gave out with relief. A car passed after a long wait, and I waved it down. The driver looked at me strangely, but I didn't care. I told him my car had broken down, and he gave me a ride back into town. When I finally sat in a diner, surrounded by people and noise, I felt like I had stepped back into another world. The thought of that cabin, sitting alone in the woods with the marks still on its walls, made my stomach turn. I didn't go back for the car. I called a tow service later, but even then, I never went with them. I never found out who or what had been outside that cabin. But I knew it wasn't just an animal. The way it moved, the way it reached the windows, the way it tapped, it wasn't random. Someone had been out there watching, waiting, circling, and I knew I would never go back to a cabin in the woods again. I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin far from the city. I wanted quiet, no distractions, no noise, and no people. The place I rented was deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest small town. The road leading there was narrow, cracked in places, with grass pushing through the broken lines. The farther I drove, the more the trees closed in, their branches forming heavy shadows over the dirt road. My car bounced over rocks and dipped into holes, and each time I felt more cut off from the rest of the world. The cabin itself looked old but solid. It was built from thick logs, darkened by age, with a stone chimney that leaned slightly. There was a small porch in the front with a broken chair, and steps that creaked under my weight when I carried my bags inside. The door stuck when I first tried to open it, but once I pushed harder, it gave way with a sharp squeak. Inside, the air smelled musty, like damp wood and something that had not been opened for too long. The first room was the living space, a square area with a fireplace, a rough rug, and a couch that looked like it had been there since the 70s. Dust coated the edges of the window panes, and cobwebs hung in the corners. To the left was a small kitchen with just enough space for a stove, sink, and a tiny fridge. At the back, a short hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything looked like it had been left behind, not updated, but still working. I set my bags in the larger bedroom and walked around to check the place. The windows all had latches, and I tested each one. They worked but squeaked loudly. The back door opened onto a porch that faced the woods, and the trees were so close it felt like the forest was pressing right against the cabin. The silence outside was heavy. No sound of cars, no voices, only the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional bird. At first, I liked the quiet. I cooked something simple, sat outside with a notebook, and listened to the woods. But as the sun went down, I began to notice how quickly the light disappeared here. The shadows stretched across the trees, and the woods became darker than I expected. By the time I turned on the porch light, The forest was already a black wall with no depth. The light only reached a few feet, leaving everything else hidden. That first night, I lay in bed listening to the creaks of the cabin. Old wood shifted with the temperature, and sometimes the wind pressed against the walls, making a low moan. I told myself it was just the normal sound of an old cabin. But around midnight, I woke up again to a noise outside. It was faint, almost like a footstep on dry leaves. I held my breath and listened. A second sound followed, slower this time, then nothing. I waited for a long time before I finally fell asleep again. The next morning, I tried to brush off the unease. I told myself animals lived in these woods. Deer, raccoons, even bears sometimes. That explained the noise. I made coffee, sat outside, and tried to relax. The day was calm, but when I looked at the ground near the back porch, I noticed something strange. The dirt there looked disturbed, as if someone had stepped on it recently. I crouched down and studied it. It wasn't a paw print. It was the shape of a shoe pressed lightly into the soil. My chest tightened. I tried to convince myself it could have been left by whoever last stayed at the cabin, maybe weeks ago. Still, it made me more aware. I walked around the property, scanning the ground. I found another faint shoe mark near the trees, but no clear trail. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checked them twice, and kept a flashlight beside my bed. Sleep came slowly. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to another sound. This time it was sharper. Something brushed against the back porch railing, followed by the creak of the wood shifting under weight. My hand closed tight on the flashlight, but I didn't move. The noise stopped. Then I heard what sounded like breathing, low and uneven. I stayed frozen, barely even breathing myself. Minutes passed before the sound faded. I wanted to get up and look through the window, but fear pinned me down. Eventually, exhaustion forced my eyes closed again, though my body stayed tense. The following morning, I went outside. The porch showed a clear mark on the railing, as if a hand had pressed against it. I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was to leave, but I told myself I might be overreacting. I had paid for a week, and it was only the second day. Maybe it was just my mind exaggerating things. I tried to distract myself by hiking a little into the woods during the day. The forest was thick with pine and oak, the ground soft with needles. But the farther I went, the less safe I felt. Every snapping twig made me turn my head. I couldn't shake the thought that someone could be out there, hidden between the trees, watching me. I didn't stay long. When I got back, the cabin felt both like a shelter and a trap. By the third night, the noises became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the porch anymore. I heard shuffling near the side of the cabin, a slow movement around the walls. Sometimes it sounded like someone dragging a stick against the wood. I stayed awake most of the night, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. Each morning I checked outside, and each time I found more signs. Footprints near the back, a cigarette butt by the side wall. Once, a small pile of broken branches arranged strangely, almost like they had been placed on purpose. I kept telling myself to leave, pack up, drive back to town, and forget about this place. But another part of me wanted to prove I wasn't being paranoid. I locked the cabin tighter, even shoved a chair against the front door. On the fourth night, the sounds changed. I heard the soft click of a window latch being tested. I sat up in bed, my whole body stiff. Another window rattled faintly. Someone was trying them one by one. My breath came fast, but I forced myself to move quietly. I picked up the flashlight and the heavy fireplace poker I had placed nearby earlier. The rattling stopped. For a long stretch, there was silence. Then I heard the crunch of leaves near the back again. A slow retreat. Whoever it was, they didn't get inside that time. When morning came, I found more footprints. This time they were clearer, circling the cabin, pressing deep into the mud near the back door. I could see the tread pattern, worn sneakers. My stomach sank as I realized how fresh they looked. That day, I couldn't focus on anything. I sat near the window with the fireplace poker across my lap, staring out. Every sound from the woods set me on edge. I barely ate. The thought of nightfall filled me with dread. The fifth night was the worst. Started the same, footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. Then a knock on the back door, faint but intentional. My chest tightened so much I thought I would pass out. Another knock, then silence. Hours passed with small sounds circling the cabin. At one point, I swore I heard the faint sound of someone breathing right outside my bedroom window. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally rose, I felt drained, dizzy, and sick from fear. I walked outside and saw the clearest sign yet. In the dirt right below my window were footprints facing directly toward the glass, standing still for what must have been minutes. That was it. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I gathered my things, shoved them into my bag, and loaded the car as fast as I could. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice before I managed to start the engine. As I drove away, I checked the mirror again and again. At one point, far down the dirt road, I thought I saw a figure step out from the trees, watching the car disappear. But I didn't slow down. When I finally reached the small town, I stopped at a gas station just to be around people again. My whole body was shaking, and I realized just how close I had been to something I didn't want to imagine. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. I didn't go back for the rest of the week, and I never returned to that cabin again. All I know is that someone was out there every night, circling, watching, testing, waiting, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I decided to spend a few days alone at the cabin deep in the woods. It was a place I had visited before, but never by myself. I had always come here with family or a friend, never without another person nearby. The cabin was old, built by my grandfather, and it sat several miles from the nearest paved road. A long dirt path, narrow and uneven, led up to it. At the start of that path was a chain gate that I locked behind me when I drove in. I liked the feeling of being cut off. No traffic noise, no neighbors close by, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. It was mid-autumn, and the air was already turning sharp at night. The trees around the cabin had lost most of their leaves, leaving the forest more open and bare than it was in summer. I could see further between the trunks, which gave me both a sense of space and also a kind of unease. There was less cover, less of a barrier, and at night the moonlight cut across the open ground in broken lines. The cabin itself was simple. A single floor, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom, a main living room that connected to the kitchen, and a wood stove in the center. The windows were old but solid, framed with thick wood. The front porch creaked under my boots when I first stepped out of the truck. I unlocked the door, carried in my supplies, and set myself up for the weekend. I brought plenty of food, water, a few changes of clothes, and some tools in case I needed to make small repairs. The first night was calm. I made a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and read a book while the wind scraped at the eaves outside. The smell of wood smoke filled the cabin, mixing with the damp scent of the old logs that made up the walls. I felt safe. Even though the silence was heavier than what I was used to back in town, I convinced myself it was nothing unusual. Out here there were no cars, no voices, just the forest and me. I slept well that first night, the stove still glowing faintly when I woke to stoke it in the early morning. The second day I spent cutting some wood with the old axe by the shed. The air was cold enough that sweat dried quickly on my skin, leaving me shivering if I paused too long. I kept busy, splitting logs and stacking them neatly under the awning. I walked down to the stream that ran not far behind the cabin and filled a small container with fresh water, though I had bottled water with me. The sound of the water moving fast over the rocks reminded me that even though the place felt still, there was constant life and movement all around. It wasn't until later that day, as the light was beginning to fade, that I noticed something unusual. At first, it was just a faint impression in the dirt road not far from where I parked the truck. A boot print, deep enough to be fresh. At first, I thought it was mine, but when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't. The tread pattern didn't match my boots. I crouched down, staring at it for a long time, running my hand across the edge of the mark. It was clear, not washed out by rain or smoothed by time. Someone had been on the road recently. I stood there for several minutes, looking around at the empty trees and the fading sky. Nothing moved. No sound but the rustling of dead leaves scattered by the wind. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a hunter had come through. Maybe someone had walked past earlier in the day while I was inside, and I just hadn't noticed. But the lock chain at the bottom of the dirt path nagged at me. No one could drive up without me knowing. Walking several miles up that rough path on foot seemed unlikely unless someone had a reason to be out here. I pushed the thought away and went back inside, but my comfort had changed. I kept glancing out the windows while I cooked dinner, checking the yard, the line of trees, the shadows stretching longer and darker. The woods looked the same as always, yet my eyes searched them for shapes that didn't belong. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. Every creak of the old wood, every groan of the wind against the roof made me sit up and listen. I told myself it was nothing. Old cabins made noise, the forest moved and shifted. It was normal. Still, I checked that the door was locked 3 times before finally letting myself lay down again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to clear my head. The ground was damp from a light frost. That was when I saw more prints. They were faint, but they circled wide around the side of the cabin, leading toward the back near the trees. I followed them for a short distance until the leaves made them impossible to track. My stomach sank as I realized whoever it was had come close. Not just along the road, but close enough to see the cabin itself. I felt a rush of unease that stuck with me the entire day. I tried to distract myself by working, by tending the fire, by reading, but every so often I found myself staring out the window again. The woods no longer looked peaceful. They looked like a screen where someone could hide, stepping in and out of sight without me knowing. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a crunch of leaves, faint but sharp enough to cut through the sound of the wind. I froze in bed, listening. Came again, then stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, my ears straining. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself I had imagined it. I stayed awake until nearly dawn, drifting into shallow sleep only when the light began to creep through the curtains. On the 4th day, I decided to leave. I told myself it was because I had enough work waiting for me back home, but deep down I knew I didn't want to stay another night. I packed my things, loaded the truck, and walked around the cabin one last time to make sure everything was locked up. That was when I found it. Behind the cabin, just under the small window that led into the kitchen, the dirt was disturbed. Kneeling down, I saw the marks of boots pressed deep into the soil. They weren't mine. The earth was scuffed, as if someone had stood there for a long time, shifting their weight. Directly above, the window pane was smeared faintly with the mark of a hand. Not enough to leave clear fingerprints, but enough that I knew someone had pressed their palm against the glass. The realization hit me hard. While I had been inside, while I had been moving around, someone had been standing right there, watching. They had been close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to see inside if they wanted to. I didn't stay another minute. I locked the cabin, climbed into the truck, and drove down the dirt path faster than I should have, the tires slipping on the uneven ground. When I reached the chain gate, my hands shook as I unhooked it and pushed it aside. I didn't stop until I was several miles down the main road, away from the trees, away from the silence. That night, back in my own house, I couldn't stop thinking about the prints, the hand on the glass, the sound in the dark. Someone had been there with me. They hadn't tried to break in, hadn't left any sign beyond the prints and that faint smudge, but they had been there, close, watching quietly. I thought about how easy it would have been for them to wait until I slept, to open a door or a window. I had been completely unaware, moving around, reading, eating, while someone stood just feet away outside. Even now, the thought sticks with me. I don't know who it was or why they were there. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living off the grid, maybe something else entirely. All I know is that they knew I was there and they stayed silent. They didn't make themselves known, didn't leave a note, didn't call out. They just watched. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. I had been looking forward to a week away from everything. A week with no traffic, no work, No phones, no people. Just me, a cabin, and the quiet of the woods. I had rented a small wooden cabin down in a valley that stretched between long ridges of pine and hardwood. It was late autumn, the air already carrying that sharp, cold bite that meant winter was close. The valley was remote, several miles from the nearest paved road, and the dirt track leading to the cabin was rough enough that even my truck had struggled in places. By the time I finally pulled in and cut the engine, there was nothing around me except the hiss of cooling metal, the ticking of the engine, and the wind moving through the trees. The cabin was small, built with old timber and a tin roof that rattled lightly when the wind cut just right. The windows were square, single-pane glass, framed in dark wood. A stone chimney rose up one side, leaning slightly, like it had been shifted by years of frost and thaw. The door creaked when I opened it, and the smell inside was a mix of wood smoke and dust. It had been used before, but not recently. The first day felt fine. I unloaded my bags, stacked the food in the small kitchen, checked the water pump, and made sure the old stove worked. It was simple, just a metal box with a pipe that led into the chimney. But when I stuffed in some kindling and lit a match, the fire caught and filled the room with warmth. The bed was a plain wooden frame with a thin mattress and heavy wool blankets. Everything was functional, not comfortable. That was fine with me. I hadn't come here for comfort. By evening, the sky was streaked red and purple. I sat outside on the small porch, listening to the birds go quiet one by one. The cold settled in fast after the sun went down, so I went inside, closed the door, and let the stove keep the room alive with heat. When I finally lay down, wrapped in the heavy blanket, I drifted off to the kind of deep sleep I never got back home. The first night passed without anything strange. It was the second night that started to feel different. That morning, I had hiked a mile or two along the valley floor, following a shallow stream that wound its way between the trees. I found tracks in the mud, deer mostly, some raccoon, maybe even coyote. Nothing unusual for the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I would stop, stand still, and listen. The forest always answered with silence, followed by the faint rustle of wind. It was probably just me being jumpy, alone in a new place. When I came back to the cabin later that afternoon, I noticed something odd. The door latch was bent slightly. At first I thought I had done it myself, maybe slammed it too hard, but the more I looked, the more it seemed wrong. The wood around the latch had a mark, like it had been pried. It unsettled me, but I told myself maybe it had always been that way. The place was old, and the wood swollen with years of weather. I pushed it out of my head. That night, after I let the stove fill with logs and the cabin glow with orange firelight, I sat at the table writing in a small notebook I had brought. The wind outside had picked up, and the tin roof rattled with every gust. I kept hearing little taps on the glass, twigs or maybe acorns carried by the air. By the time I went to bed, the woods outside were roaring with wind, and the sound of branches grinding together carried through the night. Somewhere deep in my sleep, I woke up, not because of the wind, but because I thought I had heard a sound closer, something on the porch. A soft scrape, followed by weight shifting against the wood. I stayed still, listening, barely breathing. The stove had gone quiet, only faint embers left, so the room was mostly dark. I stared at the ceiling, waiting. The sound came again, a slow press of weight against the boards outside, then silence. I forced myself to get up, stepped carefully, and went to the window. The glass was cold against my forehead as I leaned close and tried to look through. The porch was just a black shape against deeper black. Nothing moved. I stood there until my legs started to ache, then backed away. Could have been an animal, a raccoon, maybe even a bear nosing around. But I didn't like the way the steps had sounded, measured and heavy, not quick and darting like an animal. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning I went outside, looking for tracks. The ground was covered in leaves and hard dirt, but near the steps I found something. A footprint, clear as day. It wasn't mine. It was bare. No shoe tread, no boot mark. Just toes, heel, and the faint curve of an arch pressed into the cold earth. The skin on my neck prickled when I saw it. Who the hell was walking around here barefoot in the middle of the night? The nearest house was miles away. I stood there staring at the print until the wind blew leaves over it and erased it from view. I thought about packing up right then, but pride or stubbornness held me in place. I told myself it didn't have to mean anything. Maybe it was old. Maybe some hunter had walked through here in warmer weather and the print had held on in the dirt. Pushed it down and stayed. All that day, though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside to fetch wood or pump water, I felt eyes on me. Not animals, but human eyes. My skin crawled with it. That night, I locked the door tight, pushed the table against it for good measure, and made sure the fire was built up high. I lay in bed listening, my ears tuned for the faintest creak. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Just when I thought maybe nothing would happen, I heard it. The soft drag of steps outside. This time it was slower, almost deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to hear. The porch boards groaned. Then silence. Then a scrape along the sidewall, like fingers brushing wood. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart hammering, every muscle stiff. The sound circled the cabin, slow, careful. My breath came shallow. I imagined a face pressed against the glass, eyes staring in. I couldn't make myself look. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. I lay there until the pale gray of dawn started to creep into the window. When I finally dared to move, I found myself shaking from the cold and from holding still so long. I went outside in the morning and checked again. Nothing. No footprints this time, no marks on the wood. But I knew what I had heard. I knew someone had been there. By the fourth day, I was unraveling. I hadn't slept properly, every creak and groan of the cabin keeping me on edge. I stopped hiking. I stayed close, cutting wood, keeping the fire going, forcing myself to stay busy. I started carrying the axe with me even inside the cabin. I didn't like the way my own thoughts circled. The longer I stayed, the more the woods felt wrong. Too still, too quiet, like everything out there was waiting for me to make a mistake. That night, it happened again. This time louder. Heavier steps on the porch, slow, steady, coming right up to the door. I could hear the faint rattle of the latch, like someone testing it. Then silence. I gripped the axe so hard my hands hurt. The table pressed against the door shifted slightly, just a fraction, like weight had leaned against it from the outside. I waited, every second stretched thin. Then, after long minutes, the pressure left. Steps faded away into the night. I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright in the chair with the axe across my lap, waiting for morning. When daylight came, I packed my bags. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't care about finishing the week. I just wanted to get out. I hauled my stuff to the truck, loaded it in, and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. I tried again. Nothing. I checked under the hood, hands shaking, and found the battery cables loosened, almost pulled off. Someone had been under the hood. That was it. I grabbed what I could carry, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking the dirt road back toward the highway. It was 12 miles, maybe more, but I would rather walk than stay another night. The woods pressed close on both sides, the trees crowding the narrow track. Every sound made me spin, scanning the brush. I walked for hours. The sun dropped lower, shadows stretching long across the path. My legs burned, my throat dry, but I kept moving. I didn't dare stop. When dusk fell, I realized something terrible. I had walked in a loop. The road curved, twisted, and when I came around one bend, there it was, the cabin. My truck still sitting out front. My stomach dropped like stone. I stood there staring, my chest tight. Somehow, without noticing, I had circled back. The road must have forked or branched in a way I hadn't seen. The light was going fast. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't risk wandering blind in the woods after dark. I went back inside the cabin, bolted the door, and sat shaking by the fire. That night was the worst. I heard him come back just after midnight. Slow, steady steps across the porch. A pause. Then the door handle turning, rattling. The table held it shut, but the wood groaned under the pressure. My hands gripped the axe. I never thought much about being alone in the woods until I stayed in that cabin. At first, it seemed like the perfect way to escape noise and routine. I wanted silence, fresh air, and space where no one would bother me. I booked the cabin through a small private listing, not one of those popular rental sites, but something a friend of a friend had passed along. The photos showed a small wooden cabin tucked deep in the trees, with a lake not far behind it and a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been traveled much. I was told it was isolated, but I didn't really understand what isolated meant until I was there by myself. The drive in was long. The dirt road went on for miles, winding between thick forest. My cell signal started fading halfway, and by the time I pulled up to the small clearing where the cabin sat, I had no service at all. At first, that made me uneasy, but then I reminded myself that was exactly the point. I wanted to be away from everything, disconnected from work, from news, from people. The cabin looked just like the photos. Simple, one story, with a small porch in front. The wood was old, dark from years of weather, but still sturdy. The windows were small and square, with shutters on the sides. The door creaked when I opened it, and the smell of aged pine and dust hit me right away. Inside there was one main room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a couch that looked rough but usable. Off to the side was a bedroom just big enough to fit a bed and a small dresser. The bathroom was even smaller, with just a toilet and a sink. There was no shower, but there was a pump outside connected to a rain barrel for water. I unpacked slowly, setting my bag on the bed and checking everything around me. The silence was heavy. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, and occasionally the call of a bird somewhere far away. But there was no traffic, no voices, nothing mechanical except the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. That silence felt peaceful at first. The first day was easy. I walked down to the lake, sat on the dock, and just stared at the water. The surface was calm, broken only by insects skimming across it. The sun went down earlier than I expected because of the thick forest, and by the time I made my way back to the cabin, the clearing was already dim. I lit a lantern inside and heated a can of soup on the small gas burner they had left. That night, I lay in bed listening. I thought the silence would make it easy to sleep, but it was the opposite. I could hear everything: the groaning of the wood as it cooled, the scratching of tree branches against the roof, the faint rustle of something moving in the grass outside. Every sound felt sharp. I told myself it was normal, that in the city there are constant noises that drown all of this out. In the woods, even the smallest movement carried. Still, I barely slept that first night. The next morning, I decided to hike a little. There was no marked trail, but I followed the edge of the lake and then cut into the woods. The trees were dense, the ground covered in fallen leaves and soft moss. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how confusing the woods were. Every direction looked the same: trunks, branches, shadows. I told myself I would only go in as far as I could still see the lake behind me. But even then, I caught myself feeling uneasy when I turned around and realized how easy it would be to lose my way. I didn't have a map, and my phone was useless without service. Back at the cabin, I tried to relax. I read for a while, wrote in a small notebook, and cooked something simple. The day passed quietly. That night, though, something felt different. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just the creak of the wood again, but then I heard something heavier. A dull thump, like a footstep on the porch. My heart pounded. I held my breath and listened. Another sound, slow, deliberate. Not an animal scurrying, not the wind. Something heavier. I stayed frozen, staring at the ceiling. I didn't dare move. Then it stopped. The silence after was worse than the noise, because I didn't know if whatever it was still out there. I lay awake for hours until I finally drifted off as the sun began to lighten the edges of the window. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was soft dirt mixed with patches of grass. I looked for tracks, but I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Some indentations could have been from boots, or maybe just from uneven ground. I crouched down and touched them. They didn't look like animal prints. They looked like the outline of a shoe. I told myself maybe it was old. Maybe someone had been here before me and I just hadn't noticed. But something in me knew they were fresh. That whole day I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to distract myself, chopping some wood, sweeping the cabin, organizing my bag, but every time I stopped moving, I felt it. The sense that someone was out there watching. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept the lantern burning longer, but eventually I had to turn it off to save fuel. In the dark, I lay there straining to hear. Hours passed with nothing, and I began to think maybe it was just in my head. Then, just as I was finally slipping into half sleep, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. A slow step on the porch, the wood groaning under the weight. Then another. My chest tightened. I stared at the door, though I couldn't see it from the bed. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard the faintest brush against the door, like a hand testing it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound lasted only seconds. Then it was gone. No footsteps walking away, no noise at all. Just silence. When daylight came, I checked again. On the porch, near the edge, I saw it mud. A partial shoe print, clear enough to see the tread. My stomach dropped. It wasn't old. It was from the night before. Someone had been there. The thought that someone was walking around my cabin at night unsettled me more than anything else. This wasn't a campground. There were no other cabins nearby. No reason for anyone to be out here. Whoever it was hadn't knocked, hadn't said anything, just crept up in the middle of the night and stood outside. That day, I debated leaving, but the dirt road was long, my car was old, and part of me thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost. Maybe it was nothing. I convinced myself I could handle it if I just stayed alert. But the next night, it escalated. I had locked the door and checked the windows twice. I set a chair under the knob just in case. I lay there in the dark, listening. For a while, nothing happened. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard the porch creak again. The steps were slower, heavier, like whoever it was knew I was inside and didn't care if I heard. Then came a new sound, the rattle of the door handle. Slow at first, then firmer, like someone was testing it. My chest pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped the flashlight I kept beside the bed but didn't turn it on. The handle stopped rattling, but the sound of breathing carried faintly through the thin door. Someone was right there, inches away, breathing steady and low. It lasted what felt like forever, then nothing. No footsteps leaving, no sound at all. Just silence. I stayed awake until the sun came up, gripping that flashlight, certain if I closed my eyes the door would open. When I finally got the courage to look outside in the morning, the porch was empty, but on the ground, in the dirt below the steps, I saw more prints. Clearer this time. Boots. Large, wide, heavy. I knew then this wasn't an accident. Whoever it was had come back. Not once, but twice. They knew I was inside. They knew I was alone. And they were coming closer each night. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus. Every sound made me jump. The crack of a branch, the call of a crow, even the wind pushing against the cabin walls. I thought about leaving, but part of me felt trapped. The dirt road stretched for miles, and if someone wanted to stop me out there, they could. At least in the cabin I had walls, a lock, some kind of barrier. That night I sat in the dark, fully dressed, waiting. I held the flashlight and the heaviest thing I could find, a metal poker from the fireplace. Hours crawled by. Then, like before, the steps came. Slow, heavy, onto the porch. This time there was no hesitation. The door handle rattled, harder, faster. The whole door shook. My throat went dry. I braced myself, gripping the poker, ready for it to swing open. The chair I had wedged under the knob held, but the wood groaned under the pressure. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence after was worse than the noise. I couldn't hear footsteps leaving. I couldn't hear breathing. Nothing. I sat frozen for what must have been an hour, but I didn't dare move. When the sun finally came up, I found scratches along the edge of the doorframe. Deep, rough gouges like someone had dragged something sharp across it. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was trying to get in. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag fast, heart racing, and carried it to the car. The woods felt too still as I loaded everything. I half expected someone to step out from behind the trees. I got in,